In 1077, the most powerful emperor in Europe, ruler of millions of subjects, stood barefoot and biting snow for 3 days and 3 nights, begging a single man for forgiveness. That man was no general, no deity. He was a pope. Across thousands of years of history, certain men dressed in white have sat in Rome, yet their power reached farther than any army. They launched wars that shook the Middle East. They signed a document dividing the entire world between 2 empires. They dethroned kings, excommunicated emperors, and even helped bring down an entire political system in the 20th century. Today, we look back at the 10 most powerful popes in the history of humanity. Not the holiest, not the most beloved, but the ones who, whether you believe or not, truly changed the world. Chapter 1. Pope Innocent III, the man who laid all of Europe at his feet. Imagine a man sitting in Rome, commanding no great army, wielding no advanced weapons, yet the mere act of writing a letter could send kings trembling. A single word from his lips could move millions to abandon their homes, their families, and march thousands of miles to fight and die. A simple raise of his hand could bring an emperor's throne crashing down. That man was Pope Innocent III, and for nearly 2 decades he was not merely a religious leader, he was the most powerful man on earth. Lotario di Segni, Innocent III's birth name, was born in 1160 into an Italian noble family. From an early age, his family steered him toward a career in the church, sparing no expense to invest in the boy's future. He was sent to Paris, the intellectual capital of Europe at the time, to study theology, then to Bologna to study canon law. These were the 2 most important disciplines of the 12th century, and Lotario excelled at both. Upon returning to Rome, he climbed the ranks of the church hierarchy with remarkable speed. By age 29, he was already a cardinal, a position that many spent entire lifetimes trying to reach. Then, in 1198, when Pope Celestine III had just died, the cardinals convened to elect a successor. Lotario was only 37, young enough that many questioned whether he had sufficient experience. Yet after a single round of voting, he was elected by an overwhelming majority. He accepted the papal throne and took the name Innocent III. From that day forward, the history of Europe turned in an entirely new direction. To understand how Innocent III accomplished what he did, one must first understand what he believed. Innocent III held one absolute, unshakable conviction. The Pope was God's representative on earth, and therefore papal authority superseded all other powers, including that of kings and emperors. He often used a vivid image to illustrate this view. He likened the Pope to the sun, and earthly kings to the moon. The moon has no light of its own, it merely reflects the light of the sun. In other words, kings held power only because the church had granted it to them, and the church could reclaim that power at any moment. This was not the thinking of an arrogant or deluded man. In the Europe of the 12th and 13th centuries, where scripture was the foundation of all law, where fear of heaven and hell governed the actions of everyone from peasant to emperor, the Pope's words carried more weight than any sword. And Innocent III knew it. He wielded it without restraint. One of the most formidable weapons in Innocent III's arsenal was excommunication, the power to declare someone cast out from the Christian community. For an ordinary person of that era, excommunication was already catastrophic. For a king, it was a political death sentence. Once a king was excommunicated, his subjects were no longer bound by their oaths of loyalty. They had the right, even the duty, to rise up and overthrow him. Innocent III deployed this weapon many times, and he did so without a moment's hesitation. The most famous case was that of King John of England, the very king who appears in the legend of Robin Hood, renowned for his cruelty and greed. In 1205, Innocent III and King John clashed bitterly over who held the authority to appoint the Archbishop of Canterbury, the most important religious office in England. John insisted it was his prerogative. Innocent III refused to concede. After years of failed negotiations, Innocent III made an extraordinarily bold move. he placed the entire Kingdom of England under an interdict, banning all religious ceremonies throughout the land. No mass, no church weddings. The dead could not be buried with Christian rites. Children could not be baptized. Bear in mind that this was the 13th century, when people held absolute faith in heaven and hell. To die without last rites, to have a child born without baptism, these were genuine, visceral fears, not mere symbols. Pressure from the people, the nobility, and the clergy crashed down upon King John like a torrent. In 1213, King John surrendered completely. He did not merely accept Innocent III's chosen candidate as Archbishop of Canterbury. He declared the entirety of England and Ireland a papal fief, placed under the Pope's authority, and pledged an annual tribute to Rome. A king of one of Europe's greatest kingdoms had just willingly laid his entire country at the feet of a man in Rome. That was Innocent III. But Innocent III's power did not express itself through letters and decrees alone. He was also the man who launched the largest wars of his age. In 1202, he called the Fourth Crusade, with the stated goal of reclaiming Jerusalem from Muslim rule. Tens of thousands of warriors from across Europe rallied together, ready to fight and die for their faith. Yet the crusade took a direction that no one had anticipated, and that Innocent III himself had never intended. Beset by financial troubles and tangled political machinations, the Crusader army bypassed Jerusalem altogether and instead attacked Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, itself a Christian realm. In 1204, they sacked and devastated one of the greatest cities in the world. Thousand-year-old churches were looted, priceless works of art destroyed, thousands of people killed. When the news reached Rome, even Innocent III was horrified. He wrote letters condemning the attack in the harshest terms. But the painful truth was this: that army had marched at his call, and he had no practical power to rein them in once they were on the battlefield. This is an important lesson about Innocent III. His power was very real, but it had its limits. He could set enormous machines in motion, but sometimes those machines ran in directions of their own. Not all the Crusades under his watch, however, slipped beyond his control. In 1209, he launched a crusade within Europe itself, directed at the Cathar sect in southern France. The Cathars were a Christian group holding theological beliefs that diverged sharply from Rome's, and the Church deemed them a dangerous heresy. The Albigensian Crusade lasted 20 years, laid waste to the entire region of Languedoc, and nearly wiped the Cathars from existence. It remains one of the darkest chapters in church history, and it unfolded under Innocent III's direct direction. If one event were to be chosen as the clearest expression of Innocent III's stature, it would be the Fourth Lateran Council, convened in 1215, just 1 year before his death. This was one of the largest gatherings in medieval history. More than 400 bishops, 800 abbots, and representatives from nearly every kingdom in Europe assembled in Rome. Over 3 weeks, they passed 70 canons regulating nearly every aspect of Christian life. Some of these laws appeared purely religious in nature, but carried far-reaching social consequences. For instance, the council decreed that Catholics must confess their sins at least once a year, creating a system for monitoring the spiritual lives of millions that any government would have envied. The council also precisely defined the doctrine of the Eucharist, established regulations on marriage, on the election of bishops, and on a host of other matters. But one provision of that council cast a long shadow across the centuries that followed. Jews and Muslims living within Christian kingdoms were required to wear distinctive clothing to set them apart from Christians. This regulation, introduced on ostensibly religious grounds, became the foundation for centuries of discrimination and persecution of Jews across Europe. Such is the complex legacy of Innocent III, a man of towering vision, of extraordinary organizational and leadership ability, yet also a man whose decisions left painful consequences stretching across centuries. What is striking is that, beneath all the power and warfare, Innocent III was also a serious writer and theologian. Before becoming pope, he authored a book entitled on the misery of the human condition, a philosophical work meditating on the smallness and sinfulness of human existence. It became one of the most widely read texts in 13th century Europe. There is a fascinating paradox here. The most powerful man in the world, writing about human helplessness and wretchedness. Perhaps that is precisely why he understood his own power so clearly, because he knew it did not originate in himself, but in the fear and faith of millions of others. Innocent III also shared a remarkable connection with two religious figures who would shape the Church for centuries to come. It was he who approved Francis of Assisi's request to found the Franciscan order, and he who gave early patronage to Dominic and the Dominican order. Both orders would go on to become the most important missionary and intellectual forces in the Catholic Church. In 1216, while traveling to northern Italy to mediate a conflict between city-states, Innocent III fell suddenly ill and died in Perugia. He was only 55 years old. The morning after his death, his body was discovered lying nearly bare in the church. His vestments and jewels had been stolen in the night. It was a stark, bitterly ironic end for the man who had once made all of Europe tremble. But his legacy could not be stolen. Innocent III had raised the power of the papacy to heights that no one before or after him would ever reach. He proved that in a world where faith was the foundation of all social order, the one who held the keys to that faith could move the world itself. His successors tried to maintain that power, but none ever matched him. After Innocent III, papal authority began its slow, gradual descent, ending in the rupture of the Protestant Reformation 3 centuries later. Yet, in the 18 years he held power, Innocent III demonstrated something history cannot forget, that sometimes the greatest power in the world lies not at the tip of a sword, but in a sealed document bearing the mark of the man millions believe to be the representative of God. Chapter 2. Pope Gregory VII, the man who made an emperor kneel in the snow. Picture this scene. A man dressed in royal garments, stripped of his crown, standing barefoot in the biting cold of an Italian winter. He has stood there for 1 day, then 2, then 3 days in a row, barred from entering, denied proper food or drink, waiting for a single person to open the gate and grant him forgiveness. The man standing in the snow was Henry IV, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, ruler of the largest territory in Europe at the time, commanding tens of thousands of soldiers ready to die for him. The man standing behind that gate, the one with the power to decide whether it would open, was Pope Gregory VII. That moment unfolded in January 1077 at Canossa Castle in northern Italy, and it became one of the most iconic images in all of medieval history. The moment a pope forced the most powerful emperor in Europe to bow his head. But to understand why it happened, we must go back much further, to the story of a boy named Hildebrand, born into an ordinary family in the Tuscany region of Italy. No one knows Hildebrand's exact year of birth, the man who would become Gregory VII, but most historians place it somewhere between 1020 and 1025. His family was not of the nobility, held no particular wealth, and had no notable political connections. The only thing that set young Hildebrand apart was a sharp intellect and a burning religious faith that ignited early. As a child, he was sent to study at a monastery in Rome, where he gained access to senior clergy and began to understand the inner workings of the church from the inside. And what he saw both captivated and enraged him, because the Catholic Church in the 11th century was mired in a severe crisis, not a crisis of faith. People still believed in God, still attended Mass, still feared hell. The crisis was one of power and corruption. Across Europe, kings and lords were buying and selling church offices like goods at a market. Want to become a bishop? Pay the king. Want to become an abbot? Purchase the position from the local lord. This practice, known as simony, was rotting the church from within. Those who became bishops did so not through virtue or learning, but because they were wealthy or well connected to secular rulers. There was also the widespread problem of clergy taking wives and fathering children, passing their offices down to their sons like hereditary estates, entirely contrary to the Church's law of celibacy, yet practiced openly everywhere. Hildebrand saw all of this, and he believed the Church required sweeping reform from its very roots. And to reform it, the Church had to be independent of secular power, meaning kings and emperors could no longer be permitted to interfere in its internal affairs. This idea may sound straightforward, but in the context of the 11th century, it was nothing short of a revolution. For decades, long before he himself became pope, Hildebrand was the man behind several different popes. He did not sit on the throne, but he was the one truly running things. He served as advisor, as papal legate, traveling across Europe to negotiate, forge alliances, and patiently advance his reform agenda one step at a time. When Pope Leo IX needed a representative, he sent Hildebrand. When Pope Nicholas II sought to change the process of papal elections to remove royal influence, Hildebrand was the architect of that reform. In 1059, the power to elect the pope was transferred to the College of Cardinals, no longer dependent on the emperor's approval. This was a subtle move, but one of enormous consequence. For centuries, the Holy Roman Emperors had held the right to veto or even dictate the selection of the pope. That right was now stripped away. The Church had begun to choose its own leader. When Pope Alexander II died in 1073, the crowd gathered at his funeral suddenly broke into a chant, "Hildebrand for Pope, Hildebrand." It was not a formal election, but the voice of the people proved persuasive enough for the College of Cardinals. Hildebrand was elected pope and took the name Gregory VII. He had been waiting for this moment for decades, and he knew exactly what he was going to do. From the moment he took office, Gregory VII set about doing what he had spent his entire life preparing for. He issued decrees strictly forbidding simony, required clergy to observe celibacy, and, most crucially, declared that only the Pope held the authority to appoint bishops. That last point, known as the investiture controversy, was the fuse that ignited his historic clash with Emperor Henry IV. To understand why this mattered so deeply, one must know that a medieval bishop was far more than a religious leader. He was also a feudal lord, governing vast tracts of land, holding the power to collect taxes, commanding his own forces, and playing a vital role in the administrative machinery of the kingdom. Whoever controlled the appointment of bishops controlled a substantial share of political power. So when Gregory VII declared that only the Pope may appoint bishops, he was not speaking merely about religious matters. He was demanding that kings and emperors surrender a tool of power they had wielded for centuries. Henry IV, Holy Roman Emperor, ruler of territories spanning much of present-day Germany, Austria, and northern Italy, had no intention of yielding. He needed bishops loyal to him, not to Rome, and he was not shy about making that clear. In 1076, as Gregory VII continued pressing his reforms, Henry IV did something so audacious that many could scarcely believe it. He convened an assembly of German bishops and declared Gregory VII deposed. In a letter sent to Rome, he wrote bluntly that Gregory VII was not a legitimate pope and must vacate the throne immediately. The letter opened with the words, "Hildebrand, not pope, but false monk." Gregory VII received the letter and did not flinch. His response was not defensive, not diplomatic, not a call for allies. He struck back with the most powerful weapon at his disposal. He excommunicated Henry IV. More than that, he declared all of Henry IV's subjects released from their oaths of loyalty to the emperor. They were no longer obligated to obey him, and he announced that if Henry IV did not repent within a year, he would forfeit his throne permanently. This decision was comparable to someone today declaring a head of state illegitimate and announcing that the people need not follow his orders, amplified across a world where everyone believed the person saying it was the representative of God. The effect spread like a tidal wave. The German princes, many of whom already harbored grievances against Henry IV, now had righteous grounds to oppose him. They declared that if Henry IV was not absolved by February 22, 1077, they would elect a new emperor. And to do so, They invited Gregory VII to Germany to preside over the process. Henry IV suddenly realized that his empire was dissolving beneath his feet. The winter of 1077 was brutal. Gregory VII was en route to Germany at the prince's invitation when he stopped at Canossa Castle in northern Italy, the stronghold of Countess Matilda of Tuscany, one of his closest allies. Henry IV knew his time was running out. If he was not absolved before the deadline, he would lose everything. He resolved to do the unthinkable. He crossed the Alps in the dead of winter, traveled to Canossa, and requested an audience with Gregory VII to seek forgiveness. Gregory VII refused to receive him immediately. He left Henry IV waiting outside the castle gates, and a Henry IV stood there. The first day passed, snow fell, the cold was merciless. The emperor of the Holy Roman Empire stood without shoes, dressed in the gray penitent's garb of a sinner seeking mercy, barred from entering. The second day, still standing. The third day, still standing. This was not physical torture. Henry IV could have taken shelter at any moment he chose. This was a symbolic act, a public display of contrition before God and the world. And Gregory VII's decision to leave him standing there for 3 days was not cruelty. In the religious understanding of that era, it was the standard procedure for a sinner in need of absolution, regardless of who that sinner happened to be. On the 4th day, Gregory VII opened the gates and received Henry IV. He heard his confession, granted absolution, and restored Henry IV to the Christian community. All of Europe was stunned. Never before in history had an emperor of such power been made to bow before a pope in such a manner. And that moment, known ever after as the Walk to Canossa, became an immortal symbol of church authority standing above the power of the state. The story of Canossa is often told as a tale with a satisfying ending. The pope wins, the emperor loses. But the reality was far more complicated, and the rest of the story is usually left untold. Henry IV was a supremely pragmatic and patient man. When he stood in the snow at Canossa, he was not truly repentant. He was playing chess. By obtaining absolution, he had removed the pretext the German princes needed to depose him. The moment he returned to Germany, he resumed the conflict exactly as before. In 1080, Gregory VII excommunicated Henry IV a second time. But this time, far fewer took notice. Excommunicating someone who had already been excommunicated, forgiven, and excommunicated again did not carry the same shock as the first. Henry IV struck back by convening another council of bishops and electing an anti-pope, another man who claimed to be the true pope in opposition to Gregory VII. He then led his army into Italy and besieged Rome. Gregory VII found himself trapped inside Castel San Angelo. He called on his allies for rescue, and the one who answered was Robert Guiscard, the Norman lord of southern Italy. The Norman forces lifted the siege, but in doing so, they also brutally sacked Rome, turning the people of the city against Gregory VII for having brought such plunderers through their gates. Gregory VII was forced to leave Rome alongside the Norman army, heading south into exile. He settled in Salerno, ill, exhausted, far from the city to which he had devoted his entire life. In 1085, he died at Salerno on foreign soil, with his war against Henry IV still unresolved. His last recorded words were, "I have loved justice and hated iniquity. Therefore, I die in exile." On the surface, Gregory VII's life ended in failure. He died in exile. His enemy remained on the throne. Rome had been sacked. But history takes a longer view than the span of any single life. The Gregorian reform he set in motion did not die with him. His successors carried those reforms forward, and gradually the Church gained greater control over the appointment of clergy. In 1122, the Concordat of Worms finally settled the investiture dispute, and while it was a compromise rather than an outright church victory, it marked the end of the era in which kings could freely appoint bishops as though they were civil servants of the state. Beyond that, Gregory VII changed how people thought about the relationship between church and state. Before him, it was simply taken for granted that rulers had the right to intervene in church affairs. That was the natural order of things. After him, the question became a genuine and contested debate, with the Church possessing powerful arguments in defense of its independence. The moment at Canossa, an emperor standing in the snow, waiting for a pope to grant him forgiveness, became an image that was rewritten, analyzed, and debated for centuries to come. As late as the 19th century, when German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck was locked in conflict with the Catholic Church, he declared in a famous speech, "We will not go to Canossa," meaning Germany would not bow before Rome as Henry IV had done. A moment from 1077 still carried enough weight to be invoked as a symbol in 1872, nearly 800 years later. To fully understand Gregory VII, one must see him not only through the lens of political power, but also as a human being. He was a man of genuine and deeply held religious faith. Unlike some popes in history for whom secular power was clearly the primary drive, Gregory VII truly believed that everything he did served the good of Christian souls and the purity of the Church. He lived simply, accumulated no personal wealth, and repeatedly declined the papal office because he felt unworthy of it. But he was also a man of such rigidity that it sometimes worked against him. He tended to see the world in black and white, right or wrong, ally or enemy, and this made it difficult for him to sustain alliances over time. Many who initially supported him gradually drifted away, finding his demands too absolute and his refusal to compromise even slightly too exhausting. There is also a little-known aspect of his thinking that deserves attention. He was among the first in church history to argue that the Pope had the right to depose not only Christian kings, but to release the subjects of any ruler from their oaths of loyalty if that ruler acted against justice. This idea, that the power of rulers has limits and can be legitimately challenged, was a very small seed, but one that contained within it the germ of modern political thought centuries before its time. In 1606, the Catholic Church canonized Gregory VII. More than 500 years after his death, the Church formally acknowledged that the man who had died in exile, deposed by his enemies, abandoned by the people of Rome, that man had been right. And the gate of Canossa Castle, where an emperor stood 3 days in the freezing cold waiting to be forgiven, became one of the most enduring images humanity's history has left behind, a reminder that sometimes true power does not belong to those who sit on the throne, but to those who can make the ones sitting on the throne stand up and bow their heads. Chapter 3. Pope Leo I, the man who alone stopped the Hun army. In 452, one of the most fearsome armies in the history of humanity was marching into northern Italy. At its head was Attila, a man all of Europe knew by a name sufficient to silence crying children and rob adults of sleep, the Scourge of God. Attila and his Huns had swept across Eastern Europe like a flood, burning dozens of cities, slaughtering hundreds of thousands, and reducing fertile lands to ash. No fortress had held against them for long, no army had stopped their advance, and now they were turning toward Rome. The Roman emperor at the time, Valentinian III, sat trembling in Ravenna, too afraid to show his face. The Roman army had been shattered, senior officials had fled. An entire empire that had once mastered the world now had not a single person willing to step forward and face Attila. Only one man stepped forward. He carried no sword. No army marched beside him. He brought only the white robes of a pope and the belief that words could accomplish what swords could not. That man was Pope Leo I, and his meeting with Attila on the banks of the Mincio River is one of the most legendary moments in all of human history. To understand why Leo I was so extraordinary, one must understand the age in which he lived. Because the 5th century was one of the most chaotic and painful periods Europe had ever endured. The Roman Empire, once the sole superpower of the Western world, once ruling from Britain to Egypt, once building roads, bridges, and cities that would endure for thousands of years, was breaking apart piece by piece. From the north and east, barbarian tribes poured in without end. The Goths, the Vandals, the Franks, the Burgundians, and most terrifying of all, the Huns from the Asian steppes. In 410, the unthinkable happened. Rome was sacked for the first time in 800 years. The Visigoths under Alaric poured into the city and looted it for 3 days. The entire Mediterranean world reeled. St. Augustine, the greatest theologian of the age, sat in North Africa, heard the news, and wrote that all of civilization seemed to be shaking. That was the world Leo I inherited when he became pope in 440. By then, Rome was no longer the true capital of the Western Roman Empire. The court had relocated to Ravenna, surrounded by marshes and far easier to defend. Rome had become a city slowly hemorrhaging its population, its political importance, and its former pride. But Rome still possessed one thing that Ravenna did not. It was the seat of the Pope. And Pope Leo I resolved to make that the foundation of a new kind of power, not the power of swords and armies, but the power of spirit and faith. One curious thing about Leo I is how little we know of his early life. No one knows for certain when he was born. Estimates suggest sometime in the late 4th century. No one knows precisely where. Some say Rome, others say Tuscany. No one knows who his parents were, how he was educated, or what his childhood was like. History's record of Leo I begins clearly only when he had reached adulthood and was serving as a deacon in the Roman Church, where he quickly distinguished himself through his exceptional problem-solving ability and diplomatic skill. His reputation spread widely enough that sitting popes regularly entrusted him with their most delicate diplomatic missions. In 440, Pope Sixtus III died. At that moment, Leo was in Gaul, present-day France, on a sensitive diplomatic mission, mediating a dispute between 2 Roman generals. The College of Cardinals elected him pope and dispatched messengers to bring him back. When Leo I returned to Rome, he accepted the papal throne and began a pontificate of 21 years that permanently altered the standing of the papacy in the world. The first and most consequential thing Leo I did was not to confront Attila or any other external threat. The first thing he did was construct the theological argument proving that the Bishop of Rome held supreme authority over the entire Christian Church. This may sound dry, but it was in fact the foundation upon which everything else would rest. Before Leo I, the Christian Church had many centers of power. There was the Bishop of Rome in the west, but in the east stood the Bishop of Constantinople, seat of the thriving Eastern Roman Empire. There was the Bishop of Alexandria in Egypt, the Bishop of Antioch in Syria, the Bishop of Jerusalem, the city where Jesus himself had lived and died. All of these centers had long histories, large Christian communities, and their own arguments for why they mattered most. Leo I argued that the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, held the highest authority for one simple and unanswerable reason. St. Peter, to whom Jesus had personally entrusted the care of his flock, had come to Rome and died in Rome. The Bishop of Rome was therefore the direct successor of St. Peter, and so the Pope of Rome inherited the authority that Jesus had granted to Peter. This argument, known as the doctrine of Petrine succession, was not entirely new, but Leo I was the first to develop it into a rigorous theological system and to express it consistently across every action he took. In his sermons, in letters sent across the world, he returned to it again and again. When you hear my words, you hear the words of St. Peter. And when you hear the words of St. Peter, you hear the words of Christ. This was the doctrinal foundation upon which every pope after him, from Gregory VII to Innocent III to the present day, would stand to assert their authority. In 449, a theological crisis erupted within the Church that threatened to tear the Christian community in two. The dispute centered on a question that sounds metaphysical, but carried enormous political consequences. Did Jesus Christ have one nature or two? Was he fully human, fully divine, or both simultaneously? This mattered because the answer shaped the entire Christian theology of salvation. If Jesus was only divine and not truly human, his suffering held no meaning for humanity. If he was only human and not divine, he could save no one. The question had provoked controversy and even violence within the Christian community for centuries. An influential monk named Eutyches in Constantinople was spreading the view that Jesus possessed only a single divine nature and that his human nature had been absorbed into the divine as a drop of honey dissolves into the sea. This position, known as monophysitism, was gaining substantial support in the East, particularly in Egypt and Syria. Leo I refuted this view in a lengthy theological document known as the Tomus ad Flavianum, or the Tome of Leo, one of the most important theological texts in the history of Christianity. He argued with clarity and precision that Christ possessed two complete natures, fully God and fully human, subsisting in a single person without mixture, change, or separation. In 451, the Council of Chalcedon, one of the four most important councils of the early Church, was convened to settle the dispute. More than 500 bishops assembled. When Leo I's tome was read aloud, the bishops declared in unison, "Peter has spoken through Leo." This was not mere praise. It was an acknowledgement that the Bishop of Rome held supreme teaching authority within the Church. The council adopted the definition of Christ's nature exactly as Leo I had proposed, and that definition remains the official doctrine of the Catholic and Orthodox churches to this day. Yet that theological triumph, significant as it was, is not what most people recall when the name Leo I is spoken. What people remember is what happened 1 year after the Council of Chalcedon on the banks of the Mincio River in northern Italy. In the summer of 452, Attila and his Hun army had crossed the Alps and were laying waste to the cities of northern Italy. Aquileia, one of the largest and wealthiest cities in Italy, was razed so thoroughly that it took centuries before it was meaningfully rebuilt. Milan was plundered. Other cities surrendered without resistance, and Emperor Valentinian III, the man who should have been defending his realm, sat in Ravenna doing nothing. The Roman army was either too weak or too afraid to confront Attila on the battlefield. In that desperate situation, a Roman diplomatic delegation was dispatched to meet Attila and negotiate. The man chosen to lead that delegation was Pope Leo I. The meeting took place on the banks of the Mincio River, near the city of Mantua. On one side sat Attila, the conqueror who had burned half of Europe, mounted on horseback, surrounded by his fierce army. On the other stood Leo I, an elderly man in white robes, having arrived by boat, with no army and no weapons. We do not know exactly what passed between them. There is no transcript. No reliable witness recorded every word. What we know for certain is the outcome. Attila withdrew his army from Italy without marching on Rome. Why? This is the question historians have debated for 1,500 years, and there is no shortage of explanations. The simplest explanation, and the one the Catholic Church has always preferred, is that Leo I persuaded Attila through the force of his eloquence and religious authority. Some later accounts even claim that Attila saw two ghostly figures, Saints Peter and Paul, standing behind Leo I, swords drawn, threatening him with death should he dare advance on Rome. This is clearly a legend that grew in the retelling, but it reflects what people of that era believed, that something supernatural had taken place in that meeting. Modern historians, however, point to far more practical reasons for Attila's decision. First, the Hun army had been suffering from severe disease throughout its Italian campaign. The summer heat, dwindling food supplies, and an outbreak of illness, possibly malaria or some other infectious disease, had significantly weakened their numbers. Pressing on to Rome in that condition was a dangerous gamble. Second, Attila was aware that the Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople was preparing to strike from behind while he was occupied in Italy. Prolonging the campaign meant risking attack on two fronts simultaneously. Third, and perhaps most practically, there was the matter of logistics. The Huns excelled at rapid strikes and plunder, but sustaining a prolonged siege against a fortified city like Rome required a steady supply of food and weapons that they simply did not have. Leo I's delegation also brought more than words. They carried gold, pledges of tribute, and peace terms that the Roman Empire was prepared to accept. This was practical diplomacy, not a miracle. Yet whatever the true reason, Whether it was Leo I's spiritual authority, the plague, Attila's own strategic calculations, or the gold the delegation carried, the outcome cannot be denied. Rome was not destroyed in 452, and Leo I was the man who stood before Attila to negotiate. In the eyes of the Roman people, he had saved the city. And in a world where the boundary between legend and history was still very faint, that was enough to make him a hero for all time. Leo I was celebrated as the man who saved Rome from Attila. But 3 years later, he faced another trial, and this time, he could not repeat the miracle. In 455, the Vandals under Gaiseric crossed the sea from North Africa and landed in Italy. This time there was no emperor to negotiate with. Valentinian III had been assassinated just weeks earlier in an internal power struggle. Rome was entirely without a defender. Leo I stepped forward once more to meet the enemy. He met Gaiseric outside the city gates and negotiated. This time, he could not prevent the sacking of the city. Gaiseric had made up his mind, and nothing could change that. But Leo I secured one crucial concession. Gaiseric promised not to burn the city, not to kill indiscriminately, and not to torture civilians. The Vandals plundered Rome for 14 days, carrying off gold, artwork, and thousands of people into slavery. But the city was not set ablaze. The population was not massacred. It was not a victory. But given the circumstances, it was the best that could be done. And once again, Leo I was the only one who stood up to make it happen. Of everything Leo I left behind, perhaps the most surprising part of his legacy is not the dramatic encounters with Attila or Gaiseric, but his sermons and letters. Leo I was one of the finest orators and writers in the early church. More than 96 sermons and nearly 150 letters of his survive to this day, an invaluable treasury of historical and theological documents. His sermons were neither dry nor academic. They were vivid, grounded, and written in language that ordinary people could understand and feel. He often opened a sermon by drawing his listeners into a concrete image or an everyday story, then gradually leading them toward a deeper theological reflection. This approach set him apart from many contemporary theologians who preferred abstract philosophical language and argument conducted in complex technical terms. In his Christmas sermons, he urged the faithful to recognize their own dignity, for when God became human, it proved that humanity possessed infinite worth. In his Ash Wednesday sermons, he spoke not only of fasting and self-denial, but stressed that outward mortification meant nothing without genuine mercy. Share your food with the poor, liberate the oppressed, practice social justice. Those words, spoken in the 5th century in a crumbling city, are still read and reflected upon in monasteries and seminaries around the world today. Looking back across the whole of Leo I's pontificate, it becomes clear that he played a pivotal role in shaping the Catholic Church in the West as we know it today. He did this under conditions of extraordinary difficulty. In the 21 years of his papacy, the Western Roman Empire was collapsing day by day. Roman emperors grew ever weaker and more ineffectual. Barbarian tribes were tearing apart whatever remained of the old order. Disease and famine ran rampant. The population of Rome fell from several 100,000 to only a few tens of thousands. Against that backdrop of chaos, Leo I accomplished something of the utmost importance. He held firm that the Church would stand when everything else was falling. He maintained contact with bishops everywhere, coordinated the Church's response to crisis after crisis, and never ceased to insist that the Church did not depend on the survival of the Roman Empire. This was a crucial shift in thinking. For centuries before him, the Church and the Roman Empire had been bound tightly together. When Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in 313, the Church became part of the Roman state apparatus. Many Christians identified the prosperity of the empire with the prosperity of the Church. Leo I gradually separated the two. He argued that the Church was not a Roman institution that happened to believe in Christ. It was the community of those who believed in Christ, and that community existed independently of any empire or kingdom. The Roman Empire might collapse, and it was collapsing, but the Church would endure. In 476, just 11 years after Leo I's death, the Western Roman Empire officially disintegrated when its last emperor was deposed. But the Church remained. And it was the Church, not any empire or kingdom, that preserved the Latin language, the knowledge of antiquity, art and architecture, and ultimately European civilization itself through the dark centuries that followed. The foundation for all of that was laid under Leo I. Leo I died on November 10, 461, in Rome, the city he had loved, defended, and served his entire life. Unlike many other great figures of history, he did not die in exile or by assassination or removed from power. He died in office, widely revered, leaving behind a church far stronger than the one he had inherited. Almost immediately after his death, he was recognized as a saint, with no formal canonization process required, since in the 5th century such procedures did not yet exist. The people and clergy of Rome simply regarded him as a saint, and that was enough. Centuries later, the Church formally bestowed on him the title of the Great, an honor given to only 2 popes in all of history, Leo I and Gregory I. The word great was not mere flattery. It was an acknowledgement that these 2 men had permanently altered the nature of the institution they led. In 1754, Pope Benedict XIV declared Leo I a Doctor of the Church, one of the highest honors in Catholicism, reserved for those who have made outstanding contributions to theology and teaching. Chapter 4. Pope Urban II, the speech that changed the history of the world. Imagine an afternoon in November 1095 on a vast open field outside the city of Clermont in central France. Tens of thousands of people pressed together beneath a cold autumn sky. Farmers, knights, monks, lords, merchants, women, children. They have come from across the region, walking for days just to hear one man speak. There are no loudspeakers, no large screens, no technology of any kind to amplify his voice. There is only a man standing on a raised platform and tens of thousands of people holding their breath to listen. That man was Pope Urban II, and the speech he was about to deliver would not merely change the history of Europe, it would change the history of the entire world, setting in motion consequences we can still feel to this day. When he fell silent after his final words, the crowd erupted in a roar, said to have carried for miles. Deus vult! Deus vult! Deus vult! God wills it! God wills it! God wills it! And from that moment, the First Crusade, one of the most consequential events in human history, began. To understand why Urban II did what he did, and why the speech at Clermont carried such extraordinary force, one must look at the situation he inherited when he became Pope in 1088. The Church at that moment was in one of the most turbulent periods in its history. Gregory VII, the great predecessor whose story we have already told, had died in exile in 1085, his war with Emperor Henry IV unresolved. His enemies had installed an anti-pope named Clement III, who sat in Rome with Henry IV's backing and declared himself the legitimate pope. This meant that when Urban II was elected, he could not even enter Rome. The city of the papacy was in the hands of his rival. He was forced to move constantly through southern Italy and the countryside, meeting with sympathetic cardinals in small monasteries and castles, governing the church from what amounted to practical exile. This was not an ideal starting point for any leader, but Urban II was not an ordinary man. Odo de Chatillon, Urban II's birth name, was born around 1042 into a noble family in the Champagne region of northern France. Like many of noble birth in that era, he received a strong education and initially pursued a career as a secular clergyman, working within the church system without necessarily living the monastic life. But already a clergyman of some standing, he resolved to leave it all behind and enter the Abbey of Cluny, the most celebrated and influential monastery in 11th century Europe. It was not an easy decision. Cluny was renowned for its strict discipline, its demanding daily schedule, and its requirement of complete surrender of personal ambition. Yet, It was precisely that environment that forged the man Odo would become. At Cluny, he came to understand that genuine reform could only come from within, from people who truly lived the values they proclaimed. He absorbed the spirit of the Gregorian reform that Gregory VII had set in motion, and he committed himself unreservedly to the mission of purifying the Church. His reputation spread. Gregory VII took notice and appointed him Cardinal Bishop of Ostia, one of the most important cardinal positions in the Church. After Gregory VII's death and the turbulent years that followed, Odo was elected Pope and took the name Urban II. He inherited a divided church, a contested throne, and a rapidly changing world. But he possessed something many of his predecessors had lacked. He understood the French. He had been born in France, raised in France, educated in France. And in the 11th century, the French, and in particular the French knights and lords, were the most powerful military force in Europe. That would prove more important than he could have imagined. In the spring of 1095, an event in a small city called Piacenza in northern Italy would set everything in motion. Urban II was presiding over a church council there when a delegation arrived from Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire in the east. They carried a letter from Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, and its contents, though phrased in careful diplomatic language, amounted in substance to a desperate cry for help. The Byzantine Empire was in a perilous state. For decades, the Seljuk Turks, a Muslim people from Central Asia, had been expanding their territory at a breathtaking pace. In 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert, the Seljuks had dealt the Byzantine army a catastrophic defeat and taken the Byzantine emperor himself captive. Since then, the Seljuks had seized most of Anatolia, the bulk of present-day Turkey, pushing the Byzantine frontier back to within striking distance of Constantinople itself. Moreover, the Seljuk Turks now controlled Palestine and Jerusalem, Christianity's holiest land. Reports from Christian pilgrims returning from Jerusalem described harassment, robbery, and even killing along the roads to the holy sites. The pilgrimage to the Holy Land, the most important religious act for Christians of that era, was becoming extraordinarily dangerous. Emperor Alexios was asking the Pope to call on Western Christian knights to come to his aid, help defend Constantinople, and push back the Seljuk Turks. It was a fairly practical request. He needed skilled fighting men, and he believed the Pope could supply them. Urban II received this letter and began to think, but his vision reached far beyond what Alexios had asked for. Urban II was an extraordinarily astute political mind. Reading Alexios's letter, he did not see merely a request for military assistance. He saw an unprecedented opportunity to address, in a single stroke, several problems that had been weighing on him. The first was the uncontrolled violence that plagued Europe. 11th century feudal society was awash with knights and mercenaries without employment, men trained for combat who knew nothing else. They regularly waged war on one another, plundered peasants, and sowed instability everywhere. The Church had attempted to curb this violence through the Peace of God and Truce of God movements, prohibiting fighting on Sundays and feast days, but with limited effect. A crusade would redirect all that violent energy outward, away from Europe, toward a common purpose. The second was the rift between the Eastern and Western churches. In 1054, Christendom had formally split into the Roman Catholic Church in the West and the Orthodox Church in the East, an event known as the Great Schism. If Urban II could send armies to the aid of the Byzantine Empire, he might lay the groundwork for healing that division and reuniting the Church under Rome's leadership. The third problem, and the most pressing for Urban II personally, was his own authority and standing. He had not yet fully secured control of Rome, still locked in competition with the anti-pope Clement III. A resounding triumph, the liberation of Jerusalem, the rescue of the Byzantine Empire, the leadership of all Christendom in a sacred mission, would consolidate his power beyond all dispute. Urban II saw all of this clearly, and he decided to act. He announced that he would convene a great council at Clermont in November 1095, and word spread far and wide that the Pope would have a momentous announcement to make. People converged on Clermont from across the region, and when the crowds exceeded the capacity of any church or hall, it was decided to hold the address outdoors on a broad field outside the city walls. On November 27, 1095, Urban II stepped up to the platform before a crowd of tens of thousands. No official transcript of the speech survives. What we know comes from 4 or 5 different accounts written by those who were present or heard it secondhand, and those accounts do not entirely agree with one another. But the core of what was said is clear. Urban II began by describing the state of the Holy Land. He spoke of Christian pilgrims robbed, abused, and killed by the Seljuk Turks on the road to Jerusalem. He described ancient churches desecrated, holy relics destroyed, Christians in the East suffering under persecution. He used vivid, emotional language, the language of a Frenchman speaking to Frenchmen, not the remote academic language of a theologian. Then came the call to action. He declared that this was the moment for men of courage and faith to rise. He summoned the knights and lords of Europe, men who had long been fighting one another over petty causes, to turn their swords toward a purpose truly worthy of them. He promised that all who undertook this journey with genuine devotion would receive full absolution for their sins, a promise of immeasurable weight in a society where fear of sin and divine punishment was a daily reality. When he finished, the crowd erupted. The cry of "Deus vult," God wills it, thundered across the field. Many tore red cloth from their garments on the spot, stitched it into the shape of a cross, pinned it to their chests, and swore to march to Jerusalem. Urban II had not merely delivered a speech, he had lit a fire in a powder keg he could not fully control. The first lesson Urban II had to learn after Clermont was a painful one, about the gap between what he had intended and what actually happened. Urban II had envisioned the Crusade as an organized military campaign led by professional knights and lords, departing on August 15, 1096, under the command of experienced generals. This was a reasonable and workable plan, but the speech at Clermont had unleashed a wave of religious emotion that no one could contain. As early as the spring of 1096, tens of thousands of ordinary people, peasants, the poor, women, children, the elderly, began forming their own groups and setting out eastward. They carried no proper weapons, no food supplies, no march plan, no military command. They had only faith and fervor. Leading this wave was a wandering preacher named Peter the Hermit, a man of extraordinary oratorical gifts who had traveled everywhere, urging people to take up the cause. Behind him surged a disorganized multitude of tens of thousands, moving through Germany and Hungary, and as they went, they carried out horrific massacres against Jewish communities in the cities along their route, innocent people who had nothing whatsoever to do with events in Palestine. This is one of the darkest chapters of the Crusades, and it unfolded before the official campaign had even begun. Urban II had not ordered it. He had not wanted it at all. But what he had unleashed at Clermont had produced violence he could not govern. Peter the Hermit's army, known as the People's Crusade or the Paupers' Crusade, pressed on to Constantinople. Emperor Alexios received them, horrified by the chaos of this mob, and swiftly ferried them across the Bosphorus into Anatolia to be rid of them. There, they were nearly annihilated in a Seljuk ambush. Peter the Hermit survived only because he had been in Constantinople when the battle took place. But while the People's Crusade was meeting its catastrophe, the real crusade Urban II had planned was also taking shape. From across France, Italy, and Normandy, powerful lords and knights began mustering their forces. There was no king at their head, which is itself a curious detail, for all the major kings of Europe at that moment were either excommunicated or in conflict with the Pope, and therefore unable to participate. Instead, the army was led by a coalition of powerful lords, most notably Godfrey of Bouillon from Lorraine, Raymond IV of Toulouse from southern France, and Bohemond of Taranto from southern Italy. These were true warriors, thoroughly trained, battle-hardened, and possessed of sufficient resources to sustain a prolonged campaign. They departed in the summer and autumn of 1096, traveling by different routes toward Constantinople. Their journey was long and brutal, thousands of miles through unfamiliar territory, through the harsh winter of Anatolia, through sieges that dragged on for months. At Antioch, the great city of Syria, they besieged it for 8 consecutive months before taking it, only to then endure a Seljuk counterattack from outside while they were themselves trapped inside the city they had just captured. But they pressed on. And on July the 15th, 1099, 3 years after the speech at Clermont, the Crusaders took Jerusalem. And this is where the story becomes most painful. When the gates of Jerusalem opened before the Crusader army, what followed was one of the bloodiest atrocities of the medieval era. The Crusaders, exhausted after 3 years of marching, thirsting for victory and inflamed by religious zeal, poured into the city and began a massacre. They made no distinctions: Muslims, Jews, even the native Christians who lived within the city walls. Blood ran through the streets of the holiest city of the 3 great world religions. Eyewitnesses, including Crusaders themselves, recorded that blood reached ankle-deep in some parts of the city. This may be an exaggeration, but even discounting for that, what took place that day was an atrocity that admits no justification. Looking back at the full arc of the First Crusade, one thing is clear. Urban II was a genius at mobilizing masses and at political organization, but he had not, or could not, anticipate the long-term consequences of what he had set in motion. He wanted to liberate Jerusalem and protect the Christians of the East. That he achieved, at least temporarily. But he also created a dangerous precedent, the idea that violence and warfare could be a righteous religious act, that killing the enemies of the faith was not merely permissible, but would be rewarded with the forgiveness of sins. That precedent would be invoked to justify many more wars, the Second Crusade, the Third, the Fourth, and numerous others over the next 2 centuries. It would be used to justify the Albigensian Crusade against the Cathars within Europe itself. It would leave wounds in the relationship between the Christian world and the Islamic world, wounds that many argue have never fully healed to this day. Urban II had never intended any of that. But history does not concern itself with intentions, only with consequences. Urban II died on July 29, 1099, in Rome at around the age of 57. He was buried in St. Peter's Basilica and beatified in 1881 by Pope Leo XIII, meaning the Catholic Church recognized him as blessed, though not yet fully canonized, as a saint. His legacy is among the most complex in history. He was the architect of the Crusades, a movement that, depending on one's perspective, can be seen either as the highest expression of religious devotion or as one of the greatest collective failures in human history. He mobilized the energy of an entire continent toward a common purpose with an effectiveness that few leaders in history could match. And he accomplished it with words alone, on an autumn afternoon in November, on a field outside Clermont. When the crowd cried, "Deus vult," that day, they did not know they were stepping into one of the strangest, bloodiest, and most history-shaping adventures humanity has ever undertaken. And the man standing on the platform looking out over the surging multitude, the man from the Abbey of Cluny, who understood the French better than any pope before him, perhaps did not fully know either what he had just created, but he had created it, and the world was never the same again. Chapter 5. Pope Gregory I, the man who built Christian Europe from the ashes. Some people are great because they conquer, some are great because they build, and some are great because they do both, not through sword and blood, but through patience, intellect, and an unquenchable belief that even in the deepest darkness, a light can still be kindled. Gregory I belonged to that third kind. He did not stop Attila as Leo I did. He did not bring an emperor to his knees in the snow as Gregory VII did. He did not launch the Crusades as Urban II did. What he did was far less dramatic, but perhaps more enduring than all of those things combined. Gregory I built the Western Catholic Church from the ruins of a collapsed empire, transformed it into the only beacon still burning in the darkness of what is called the Dark Ages, and laid the foundations for a new civilization that would shape Europe for the next 1,000 years. That is why people call him the Great, and why he deserves that title more than almost anyone in history. To understand Gregory I, one must first understand what Rome looked like in 590. And the answer is, it looked like a city dying. Only a century before, Rome had still been the spiritual and cultural capital of the entire Western world, home to hundreds of thousands, where magnificent palaces and temples rose as testimony to human power. But since the Western Roman Empire officially dissolved in 476, everything had declined with dizzying speed. Rome's population had plummeted from a peak of perhaps 1 million at its height to somewhere between 20 and 30,000, a catastrophic collapse. The extraordinary aqueducts the Romans had built fell into disrepair with no one to maintain them, draining the fountains and public baths dry. Sewers went untended, turning streets that had once teemed with life into muddy, foul-smelling channels. Great architectural monuments crumbled slowly, and the people stripped stone from old buildings to construct new ones, destroying 1,000 years of heritage for the sake of temporary building materials. Famine appeared regularly as the agricultural and food distribution systems had broken down. Disease ravaged the city, especially the plague, which killed indiscriminately, regardless of wealth or standing. Outside the walls, the Lombards, a barbarian people from the north, occupied most of the Italian peninsula and threatened to attack Rome at any moment. And the one who should have been protecting Rome, the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople, was too distant, too preoccupied with his own troubles, and in truth, too indifferent to the fate of this faraway city. That was the Rome Gregory I inherited when he became pope in September 590. And the first thing he did upon becoming pope was to try to refuse the position. The story of Gregory I begins with a compelling paradox. He was one of the greatest popes in history, and he was a man who had no wish to become pope. Gregory was born around 540 into a wealthy Roman noble family with a long tradition of public service. His family was rich not only in money but in political and religious connections. According to some sources, 2 relatives had previously served as popes. Given such origins, Gregory's natural path was into the machinery of the state, and that is precisely where he went. Around 573, while still in his early 30s, he was appointed prefect of Rome, the highest administrative office in the city, comparable to a mayor today, but with considerably broader powers. This was the pinnacle of secular achievement that most Roman noblemen spent entire lifetimes dreaming of. Yet, Gregory was not happy. He carried out the role responsibly and performed his duties well, but inwardly, he never ceased to feel that this was not what he truly wanted to do with his life. In 574, when his father died, Gregory made a decision that astonished everyone around him. He abandoned his entire career, sold or gave away most of his inheritance, and converted the large family villa on the Caelian Hill in Rome into a monastery. Then, he entered that monastery and lived as an ordinary monk. The years in the monastery were the happiest of Gregory's life. He read, prayed, meditated, wrote, and dwelt in the quiet he had long craved. He practiced asceticism with such rigor that his health began to suffer, a problem that would follow him for the rest of his life. But that tranquility did not last. Pope Pelagius II recognized Gregory's gifts and drew him out of the monastery, ordaining him as a deacon and entrusting him with increasingly important responsibilities. Gregory accepted out of obedience, but never stopped longing to return to the peaceful life of the cloister. In 590, the plague swept through Rome, claiming the life of Pope Pelagius II. When people looked around for a successor, every eye turned to Gregory. He had administrative experience, theological learning, widely respected virtue, and demonstrated leadership ability. He was the obvious and unavoidable choice. Gregory knew it, and he was so afraid that he wrote a letter to the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople begging him not to ratify the election. He even entrusted the letter to a messenger, but the messenger, understanding that Gregory was the only person capable of saving the situation, never sent it. The emperor ratified Gregory's election, and the man who had not wanted to be pope became Pope Gregory I. The first thing Gregory I did upon becoming pope astonished those around him. He began to govern Rome as a head of state, not merely as a religious leader. This may seem unremarkable today, but in 590 it was a historic turning point. Before Gregory I, the Pope was primarily a spiritual leader, one who tended to the souls of Christians, not to their stomachs or their physical safety. The provision of food, the defense of the city, the maintenance of order, these were the business of state officials, not of the church. But in 590, there was no functioning state in Rome. The Byzantine officials were far away and unconcerned. The Lombards encircled the city. The people were starving and dying of plague. And there was no one else to save them but the Pope. Gregory I did not hesitate. He drew on the church's treasury, wealth accumulated through centuries of donations by the wealthy, and organized a food distribution system for the poor of Rome. He managed and improved the vast agricultural estates the church owned in Sicily and elsewhere, turning them into a reliable food supply for the city. He hired soldiers to guard the walls. He negotiated directly with Lombard chieftains when the Byzantine emperor did nothing. A famous story recounts that when the Lombards besieged Rome and the emperor still sent no troops, Gregory I went himself to negotiate with the Lombard commander and secured a ceasefire, saving the city from attack. He afterward wrote a bitter letter to the emperor's representative in Constantinople, describing himself as the steward of the emperor's property, because he had been forced to do everything that should have been the Byzantine state's responsibility. This is something people often overlook when they think of Gregory I. He was not a great pope solely because of his theological or liturgical contributions. He was great because in an age when the state had collapsed, he stepped in to fill that void, and in doing so, he completely redefined the role of the Church in European society. From Gregory I onward, the Catholic Church was no longer merely a place where people came to pray and make confession. It was the organization that provided social services, education, healthcare, and administrative governance for millions of people across the continent. That model persisted throughout the medieval centuries, and Gregory I was the first to establish it. But Gregory I did not limit his concern to Rome. He looked further, toward the dark lands to the north and west of Europe, where the light of Christianity had not yet reached or had already been extinguished. There is a famous story, retold across many centuries, about the origin of Gregory I's decision to send missionaries to England. It recounts that one day, before he became pope, Gregory was passing through the slave market in Rome when he noticed a group of children with golden hair, fair rosy skin, and blue eyes, entirely unlike Italians or people from the Mediterranean world. Curious, he asked where these children came from. He was told they were Angles, from the distant island of Britain. He asked whether they had been baptized and was told they had not. They were pagans. Gregory sat down and spoke words that were later recorded as one of the most celebrated puns in church history. Non angli, sed angeli. Not angles, but angels. Then he added, faces such as these deserve to look upon the faces of the angels in heaven. This story may be legend or truth, or some mixture of both. But what is not legend is Gregory I's decision upon becoming pope. He resolved to send missionaries to Britain to evangelize the Anglo-Saxons. In 596, he selected a monk from his own monastery on the Caelian Hill, a man named Augustine, later known as Augustine of Canterbury, and entrusted him with the task of leading a mission of some 40 monks to England. It was a mission so daunting that Augustine and his companions grew so frightened they asked permission to turn back halfway. England at that time was a wild and unfamiliar land, fragmented into numerous small kingdoms of pagan Anglo-Saxons and other tribes. There was no guarantee these monks would be welcomed rather than killed. Gregory I wrote to encourage Augustine and his group, reminding them that great things are never easy and that fear is natural but must never be allowed to become a reason for abandoning a mission. Augustine and the missionaries pressed on, and something remarkable happened. King Ethelbert of Kent, one of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in southern England, received them not because he was a Christian, but because his wife, Queen Bertha, was a Frankish Christian. King Ethelbert listened to Augustine preach, and before long he was baptized. When the king converted, his people followed. That was how feudal society worked. In 597, Augustine was consecrated as the first Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest religious office in England, one that exists to this day. The mission to England, organized under Gregory I, was one of the most important events in the history of the British Isles and in the history of Christianity worldwide. It laid the foundation for the connection between England and Rome, shaped the culture and civilization of a nation, and ultimately influenced global history in ways that no one in 596 could possibly have imagined. If Gregory I had accomplished only two things, governing Rome and sending missionaries to England, he would already deserve to be remembered. But he left behind a third legacy, entirely different in nature, yet no less significant. He standardized and developed Catholic liturgical music, creating the foundation for what we now call Gregorian chant. Gregorian chant consists of unaccompanied liturgical songs sung by monks and clergy during religious services. They are characterized by simple flowing melodies, smooth as a running stream, with no fixed rhythm, creating an atmosphere that is sacred, still, and distinctly transcendent. Before Gregory I, liturgical music varied widely across different regions of the Christian world. Each area had its own traditions, each monastery sang in its own way, and there was no unity whatsoever. Gregory I recognized that unity in worship mattered. It created a sense of belonging to a shared community regardless of where one was in the world. He collected, organized, and standardized the Church's treasury of liturgical music. He founded or strengthened a music school in Rome to train professional singers and spread standardized liturgical music everywhere. And he personally attended to the quality of music in religious services, a rather remarkable thing for a man who had hundreds of practical administrative problems to manage. Today, Gregorian chant still exists and is still sung in monasteries and churches around the world. If you have ever stepped into a traditional Catholic church and heard monophonic mystical voices rising from the stone nave, you are hearing the echo of the legacy Gregory I left behind more than 1,400 years ago. Another aspect of Gregory I that is rarely mentioned but enormously important is that he was one of the most influential writers and thinkers in the history of Western Christianity. He wrote prolifically, not because he enjoyed writing, but because he felt a responsibility to explain the Christian faith in language ordinary people could understand. His writing style was entirely unlike that of the scholarly theologians of his day, who wrote in ornate Latin filled with obscure philosophical terminology. Gregory I wrote in plain language, used many concrete examples and illustrative stories, and always aimed at practical application in daily life. His most important work was Moralia in Job, a long and profound commentary on the book of Job in the Bible. This was a work he began while still a monk and continued refining for many years. It is not a dry academic commentary. It is a deep meditation on the meaning of suffering, on how people cope with adversity, and on the relationship between humanity and God. This work was read and studied in monasteries across Europe throughout the entire Middle Ages. He also wrote Cura Pastoralis, roughly translated as the Book of Pastoral Care, a handbook on the art of religious leadership. He wrote about how a shepherd, meaning a bishop or priest, must know how to adjust his approach depending on the person standing before him. Speak one way to the wealthy, another way to the poor. Explain things one way to the educated, another way to those with little schooling. Use one kind of language with those who are joyful, and another with those who are suffering. This is, in essence, a book of applied psychology, written in the 6th century, and its principles remain sound to this day. The book became so renowned that King Alfred the Great of England, who reigned in the 9th century, 300 years after Gregory I's death, personally translated it into Old English and sent copies to every bishop in his kingdom. Alfred considered it the most important book for anyone bearing the responsibility of leadership. One of the greatest challenges Gregory I faced throughout his pontificate was the Lombards, the barbarian tribe occupying much of Italy and threatening Rome. The Byzantine Empire's policy was to fight the Lombards and drive them out of Italy. Gregory I did not believe this was the right approach, not because he was weak or fearful, but because he was realistic enough to recognize that the Byzantine forces were not strong enough to accomplish it, and that every time war broke out, it was ordinary Italian people who suffered most. Instead, Gregory I pursued a different strategy. He began building a relationship with the Lombards, particularly with Queen Theodelinda, wife of the Lombard king Agilulf, a woman of deep Christian faith who wished her husband would convert. Gregory I corresponded regularly with Theodelinda, sent her precious religious gifts, and through her sought to influence her husband. He also negotiated directly with Lombard chieftains to achieve temporary ceasefires when war erupted. The strategy was neither swift nor completely successful during his lifetime, but it laid the groundwork for the Christianization of the Lombards that unfolded over the following decades, transforming them from a threat into a part of the Western Christian world. This is a quintessential example of how Gregory I thought and acted. He did not try to solve problems through direct confrontation when that was not feasible. Instead, he patiently sought the longer but more sustainable path. There is something poignant about Gregory I that few people know. He accomplished all of these great things while enduring constant and increasingly severe physical pain. The years of strict ascetic life in the monastery during his youth had left their mark on his health. By the time he became pope, he already had serious digestive problems, described in his letters as terrible stomach pains, persistent nausea, and exhaustion. He also suffered frequent high fevers and gout, an excruciating joint condition. In his final years, he was barely able to rise from his bed. Yet even while bedridden, he continued to work. He listened to reports read aloud to him, dictated letters that needed to be sent, and made decisions about church administration. In his final years, his secretaries recorded that he often had to stop mid-sentence when the pain became too intense, rest for a moment, then carry on. He also never ceased blaming himself for his shortcomings. In many letters and sermons, he described himself as a man full of sin and failings, unworthy of the responsibility entrusted to him. Readers today might assume this was false modesty, but those who have studied his life closely believe these were genuine feelings. Gregory I truly felt the weight of responsibility pressing down upon him, and he truly feared that he was not doing enough. The final thing to be said about Gregory I is his contribution to defining what the office of the Pope is and ought to be. He was the first to use the title Servus Servorum Dei, servant of the servants of God, to describe himself as Pope. This is not a name that sounds powerful or grand. It actually emphasizes humility and service. Gregory I wanted everyone to understand that the Pope is not a prince or a king seated on a throne issuing commands. The Pope is a servant, a caregiver, someone accountable before God for the souls entrusted to his care. That title, Servus Servorum Dei, is still used by popes to this day, more than 1,400 years after Gregory I first coined it. At the same time, he firmly asserted the real authority of the papacy when necessary. When the Bishop of Constantinople, who had styled himself ecumenical patriarch, attempted to claim supreme authority over all others, Gregory I objected strongly, arguing that no bishop, not even the Bishop of Constantinople, could place himself above all other bishops. He also argued, of course, that the Bishop of Rome held special authority as the successor of St. Peter, but that authority was one of service, not dominion. This is a nuanced combination, outwardly paradoxical, yet inwardly entirely consistent. The Pope is simultaneously a humble servant and the supreme authority. That combination defined the papacy for centuries to come. Gregory I died on March 12, 604, in Rome, after 13.5 years as Pope. He died in his room, in his bed, surrounded by secretaries and trusted colleagues. There was nothing heroic or dramatic about his death, no encounter with an invading army, no thunderous final declaration, no memorable symbolic gesture. He simply wore out gradually over years of ceaseless work as his body grew ever weaker, and one morning in March, he did not wake up again. Immediately after his death, the people of Rome rallied to demand his canonization. It happened very quickly, faster than any formal process, because in the 7th century, the process of canonization had not yet been systematized. He was regarded as a saint from the very first days after his death. More than a century later, an English monk named Bede, known as the father of English history, wrote about Gregory I with profound gratitude, calling him our apostle, for it was Gregory who had sent Augustine to England and brought the Christian faith to Bede's homeland. Looking back at the life of Gregory I from a distance of more than 1,400 years, what is most striking is not any single achievement, but the totality of what he left behind. He served as pope at a moment when everything might have collapsed entirely, when Rome was dying, when the Roman Empire had already disintegrated, when barbarian tribes controlled most of Europe, and when no state was strong enough to maintain order or preserve civilization. In that context, he transformed the church into the anchor that held on to whatever could still be held: writing, knowledge, art, law, and above all, the idea that human life has meaning and dignity. He did this not by sitting on a high throne and issuing commands. He did it by writing letters, organizing food distribution, sending monks to distant and unfamiliar lands, arranging the songs sung in monasteries, writing books explaining the faith in language ordinary people could understand, one small task at a time, day by day, for 13 years, even as his body ached and his spirit sometimes faltered. The Christian Europe we know from history, with monasteries as centers of learning, with the church as provider of education and social welfare, with sacred music echoing through stone churches, with missionaries crossing seas to distant lands, all of it bears the trace of Gregory I in its foundations. And that is why, among all the popes in the entire history of the Catholic Church, only 2 have ever been called the Great, and Gregory I is one of them. Not because he turned back Attila or brought an emperor to his knees, but because in the deepest darkness of European history, he was the one who patiently kept the light burning, so that 1,000 years later, when the darkness lifted, the light was still there, and human civilization was still there, to continue onward. Chapter 6. Pope Boniface VIII, the man who claimed to rule both the souls and bodies of humanity. In 1302, a document issued from Rome caused all of Europe to stop and read it over and over again, making certain they had understood it correctly. The document was called Unum Sanctum, 2 Latin words meaning one holy, and its contents were so audacious that many who read it did not know whether to be astonished or outraged. It declared that there was only one Christian church, and at its head stood the Pope, that all earthly rulers were required to submit to the Pope, that the Pope had the right to judge everyone, and no one had the right to judge the Pope, and the final conclusion, written in language that admitted no interpretation other than the literal, that to be saved, every human being on earth must submit to the Pope of Rome, every human being, no exceptions. The man who wrote that document was Pope Boniface VIII, and he did not write it in a moment of impulse or as a figure of speech. He wrote it because he genuinely believed every word of it, and he was prepared to stake his career and his life in its defense. The story of Boniface VIII is the story of a man of towering vision who could not read the times, a man who pushed papal power to its absolute limit, and in doing so not only brought about his own destruction, but inadvertently opened the door to an irreversible decline of that power. Benedetto Caetani, Boniface VIII's birth name, was born around 1235 into a noble family in Anagni, in central Italy. Unlike many popes remembered for personal virtue or piety, Caetani became known early for something else entirely: a razor-sharp legal intellect and undisguised ambition. He studied canon law, the language of power in the medieval church, and became one of the foremost legal experts of his age. His career within the church's machinery climbed steadily and deliberately, from notary of the Holy See to papal legate in France and England, to cardinal, and finally to the papal throne itself in 1294. But his path to that throne began with one of the strangest events in church history, and more than a few people later suspected that he had engineered the whole thing himself. His predecessor was Pope Celestine V, an elderly, devout monk, but entirely incapable of governing the church. Celestine V had been elected after a conclave that dragged on for more than 2 years, the cardinals unable to reach agreement. When news of his election spread, he was living as a hermit in a cave in southern Italy and had to be sought out and persuaded to accept the throne. Celestine V was thoroughly unsuited to the role of pope. He was exploited by everyone around him, especially King Charles II of Naples, who all but directed him as a puppet. After fewer than 5 months, Celestine V did something that had never happened before in church history. He abdicated, renouncing the papal throne. Caetani was the man at Celestine's side throughout those months, his legal advisor on the validity of the abdication, and the man working behind the scenes to secure his own election once Celestine stepped down. Just 11 days after Celestine V vacated the throne, Caetani was elected pope. Many contemporaries, and many historians since, suspected that Caetani had manipulated and pressured Celestine V into abdicating to clear the way for himself. There is no direct evidence for this, but nothing disproves it either. What is certain is that Boniface VIII took the throne and immediately had Celestine V, his predecessor, imprisoned in a castle, ensuring he could not become a rallying point for dissidents. Celestine V died in captivity in 1296, denied his freedom in the final years of his life. It was not an auspicious beginning for a man who wished to be remembered as a moral leader. The poet Dante Alighieri, a contemporary and political enemy of Boniface VIII, later placed Celestine V in hell in the Divine Comedy for the sin of the great refusal in abdicating, and reserved a special place for Boniface VIII in the deepest circle of hell among those guilty of simony. It is one of the most scathing literary verdicts ever delivered upon a pope. Boniface VIII ascended the papal throne with the absolute conviction that he was continuing and perfecting the legacy of Innocent III, the most powerful pope in history, the man who had laid all of Europe at his feet nearly a century before. What he did not recognize, or refused to recognize, was that the world had changed profoundly in the time between Innocent III and himself. In the late 13th and early 14th centuries, the kingdoms of Europe were growing stronger in ways that had no precedent. Kings were no longer simply feudal lords, each ruling a small patch of land and dependent on the personal loyalty of knights and local nobles. They were building genuine state apparatus, salaried officials, tax systems, unified law, standing armies. They were becoming the leaders of what we would today call nation-states. In the process, they increasingly resented anyone, including the Pope, interfering in the internal affairs of their kingdoms. Above all, they resented the Pope's claim to tax clergy within their territories, since that represented an enormous flow of money leaving their borders for Rome. This was the world Boniface VIII stepped into. And rather than acknowledging this change and seeking to adapt, he chose to confront it head-on. The greatest enemy of Boniface VIII, and the man who ultimately defeated him, was Philip IV of France, whom history has called Philip the Fair for his striking appearance. Philip IV was an exceptionally pragmatic and determined king who regarded the building of a strong, independent French state as the mission of his life. He did not hate the church or religion. He simply believed that within the territory of France, the French king must hold supreme authority, including authority over the clergy. In 1296, needing money to wage war against England, Philip IV decided to tax the French clergy, who by tradition had been exempt from taxation. Boniface VIII responded immediately with the decree Clericis Laicos, declaring that clergy were forbidden from paying taxes to secular rulers without the Pope's permission, and that any king who taxed the clergy would face excommunication. Philip IV did not flinch. He ordered a ban on the export of gold and silver from France, cutting off a major source of church revenue flowing from France to Rome. Boniface VIII suddenly realized he had underestimated his opponent. He backed down, sought to reduce tensions, and even canonized Philip's grandfather, Louis IX, a transparent gesture of conciliation. But this was only the first round of a contest that would last for years. In 1300, Boniface VIII organized the first Holy Year in the history of the Catholic Church, an event in which he declared that anyone who made a pilgrimage to Rome that year and went to confession would receive full remission of all temporal punishment for their sins. This was an idea of genius, both religiously and politically. Hundreds of thousands of pilgrims from across Europe flooded into Rome. Estimates suggest around 2 million people over the course of the year, a staggering number relative to the population of Europe at the time. Rome became once again the center of the Christian world. The Church collected vast revenues from these pilgrims, and the prestige of Boniface VIII reached its zenith. Dante Alighieri himself, though he would later become Boniface's political enemy, was present in Rome during that Holy Year and was profoundly struck by the scale and grandeur of the event. He described the stream of pilgrims on the Ponte Sant'Angelo as a river of humanity that never ran dry. But even at that summit of glory, the seeds of disaster were already being sown. Because the Jubilee of 1300 was the embodiment of a vision of papal power that not everyone accepted, and those who did not accept it were growing bolder in saying so. The second round of the conflict with Philip IV began in 1301, when Philip had a French bishop arrested on charges of treason and put on trial without seeking Rome's permission. Boniface VIII protested furiously, declaring that clergy could not be tried in secular courts. Philip IV convened a national assembly and published a series of accusations against Boniface VIII, including heresy, simony, incest, and even sodomy. These charges rested on no concrete evidence, but they were aired publicly to discredit the Pope in the eyes of the French people. Boniface VIII struck back with the weapon most familiar to him, words and the written page. In 1302, he issued the decree Unum Sanctum, and this is the moment when he crossed a line that made even the most ardent supporters of papal authority uncomfortable. Unum Sanctum argued that the Christian Church was one and indivisible, that outside the Church there was no salvation, that the Pope was the supreme leader of that Church, and that therefore all people, including secular rulers, must submit to the Pope in every matter touching the salvation of their souls. The final sentence of the decree is the most quoted and most debated line in the history of papal documents. We declare, say, define, and pronounce that it is altogether necessary for the salvation of every human being to submit to the Roman Pontiff. This was not a declaration of direct political authority. Boniface VIII was not claiming that the Pope could issue commands to kings on the conduct of everyday governance. He was claiming something deeper and more fundamental, that even the soul of a king, even the eternal salvation of an emperor, lay in the Pope's hands. In a society where people genuinely believed in heaven and hell, that claim carried immense force. But it was also a claim too extreme, too audacious, too defiant, and it provoked a reaction that Boniface VIII had not anticipated. Philip IV did not answer Unum Sanctum with theology. He answered it with politics. He convened an assembly of clergy, nobles, and representatives of French cities, what is considered the first Estates General in French history, and put a direct question to them. Who held supreme authority in the Kingdom of France, the king or the Pope? The assembly's answer, unsurprisingly, came down in favor of the king. But Philip IV did not stop there. He assigned his closest advisor, Guillaume de Nogaret, a brilliant and equally ruthless lawyer, the task of dealing with Boniface VIII once and for all. Nogaret drew up a lengthy indictment against Boniface VIII, listing dozens of charges, and set out for Italy with a group of men and a plan so audacious it bordered on madness, to seize the Pope and bring him back to France to stand trial. In September 1303, Boniface VIII was staying at his family's palace in Anagni, his ancestral hometown in central Italy, when Nogaret and an armed force led by the Colonna family attacked the city. The Colonna were long-standing enemies of Boniface VIII. 2 cardinals from that family had previously been stripped of their offices and driven into exile by him, and they were hungry for revenge. With Philip IV's financial and political backing, they assembled a force large enough to overwhelm the papal palace guard. The gates of Anagni were opened from within by collaborators. Nogaret's and Colonna's men flooded into the city, looting the homes and property of the townspeople, and marched straight to the palace of Boniface VIII. And here is where the story becomes strange and tragic in ways that differ depending on who is telling it. According to the tradition most widely repeated, when the attackers broke down the palace gates, Boniface VIII, then nearly 70 years old and gravely ill, neither fled nor begged. He dressed himself in full papal vestments, put on the tiara, took up the keys and the cross, and sat upon his throne to await them. When Nogaret and Sciarra Colonna entered the room, they found an old man sitting bolt upright on his throne, looking them directly in the eye without a tremor of fear. Sciarra Colonna, the one who harbored the deepest personal hatred for Boniface, stepped forward and struck the Pope across the face, or threw a gauntlet at him, or knocked him to the ground. Different sources tell it differently, and no one knows with certainty what actually happened in that room. What is certain is this: the Pope was held captive in his own palace, placed under guard, humiliated, and treated as a prisoner for 3 days. The people of Anagni, though initially caught off guard and offering no resistance, gradually rallied. After 3 days, they rose up against the occupiers and drove them from the city, freeing Boniface VIII. Physically, the Pope was free, but something inside him had broken beyond repair. After being freed from Anagni, Boniface VIII was brought back to Rome, but the man who returned was no longer the man who had left. Those around him described him as a hollowed-out figure, not speaking, not eating at regular hours, sitting alone and at times talking to himself. Some believed he had suffered such severe psychological shock that he had come close to losing his mind. Others said he had simply died inside after watching everything he had believed in and built be destroyed in 3 days at Anagni. Just over a month after returning to Rome, on October 11th, 1303, Boniface VIII died. He passed away in the Lateran Palace in Rome, in the arms of his attendants. He had been pope for only 9 years, but those 9 years changed history in ways he never intended. After Boniface VIII's death, his story continued to live on, in part through the caustic pen of Dante Alighieri. Dante was Florentine, and Florence had been a victim of Boniface VIII's political interference in the city's internal affairs. In 1301, Boniface VIII had indirectly brought about the downfall of the political faction to which Dante belonged, and Dante was sentenced to permanent exile from his hometown, a punishment he carried with him for the rest of his life. In the Divine Comedy, the greatest work of medieval literature, Dante placed Boniface VIII in hell, even before he had actually died. In Canto 19, as Dante walks through hell and encounters a soul plunged headfirst into a pit with its feet on fire, the soul mistakes Dante for Boniface VIII, assuming he has arrived ahead of schedule. When it is explained that this is not Boniface, the soul simply continues to be tormented while waiting for Boniface to come and take its place. This is literary humiliation at its most refined. Dante does not merely place Boniface in hell, he places him there while Boniface is still alive, declaring that his fate has already been sealed. What is interesting, however, is that despite his political hatred of Boniface VIII, Dante did not reject the idea of papal authority itself. He simply believed that Boniface VIII was the wrong man holding a rightful office. This is a subtle but important distinction. It shows that even the fiercest opponents of Boniface VIII had not yet begun to question the papacy as an institution. That would come, but much later. Looking back at Boniface VIII across the distance of centuries, the most striking thing is the paradox at the heart of his legacy. He was the one who asserted papal authority most forcefully, most boldly, and most comprehensively in history. Unum Sanctum stands as the pinnacle of reasoning about papal supremacy. No pope before or after him made a broader or more unequivocal claim. Yet it was precisely because of those claims that he also witnessed and helped bring about the collapse of papal power in practice. Because when you claim too much and cannot deliver, the consequences are worse than having claimed nothing at all. After Boniface VIII's death, what followed was a chain of events that showed Philip IV had won this contest decisively and completely. Boniface's first successor held the papacy for only 8 months before dying. The next successor, Clement V, was French, and rather than residing in Rome, he moved the entire Holy See to Avignon in southern France, where it remained for the next 70 years under the heavy influence of the French crown. Those 70 years came to be called the Babylonian captivity of the Church. The Pope, who had just proclaimed his authority over both the souls and the bodies of all humanity, was now in practice a puppet in the hands of a French king. This is the legacy of Boniface VIII, not the power he proclaimed, but the collapse those proclamations dragged down with them. The story of Boniface VIII is a painful lesson in the difference between power on paper and power in reality, and about the danger of living in the past when the world has already moved into a new era. He believed he was doing what Innocent III had done, asserting the supremacy of the Church over secular rulers. But Innocent III had acted in a world where kings were still weak and lacked an independent power base. Boniface VIII acted in a world where nations were forming their own identities and their own power, where people increasingly identified with their country rather than with the Church. When Philip IV asked the people of France whether they owed their loyalty to the French king or to the Roman Pope, the answer no longer fell automatically in the direction Boniface VIII had expected. And that was the fundamental shift he either could not see or refused to see. Boniface VIII was the last person who truly tried to wield the doctrine of absolute papal supremacy as a practical political weapon. After him, later popes continued to maintain those claims in theory, but none dared to actually apply them in the way he had. He died in loneliness and spiritual exhaustion, a man shattered by 3 days in an agony. But even in that death, there is something worth remembering. When his enemies broke down the gates, he did not run. He dressed himself in full vestments, sat upright on his throne, and faced them. Whether he was right or wrong in what he believed it to the very end, and never retreated a single step. That is not greatness, but in a way that is very sad and very human, it is courage. Chapter 7. Pope Alexander VI, the most sinful man to sit upon the most sacred throne. In 1493, a document written in Rome divided the entire undiscovered world into 2 equal halves. One half belonged to Spain, the other to Portugal. Hundreds of millions of indigenous people in the Americas, Africa, and Asia, people who had never heard of Rome, who had never known that something called a pope existed in the world, suddenly became the lawful subjects of 2 European empires, simply because a man in Rome put his name to a piece of paper. That man was Pope Alexander VI, and that document, known as the Papal Bull Inter Caetera, is one of the most consequential geopolitical texts in human history, shaping the fate of billions of people for centuries to come. But Alexander VI is not remembered primarily for that document. He is remembered, or rather infamous, as the most scandalous pope in Catholic history. A man who fathered children out of wedlock and raised them openly. A man accused of buying the papal throne with money. A man whose family, the Borgias, became so synonymous with corruption, scheming, and crime that the name Borgia remains in many European languages to this day a byword for political cunning. The story of Alexander VI is the story of the greatest contradiction imaginable, the most sinful man occupying the most sacred seat, and in doing so, leaving one of the largest geopolitical footprints in history. To understand Alexander VI, one must understand where he came from, and the answer is from a family that had long since decided power was something to be pursued at any cost. Rodrigo Borgia, Alexander VI's birth name, was born in 1431 in Chativa. a small town in the Valencia region of Spain. The Borgias were Spanish by origin, not Italian like so many other popes, and that would become the source of much of the hostility and prejudice he faced later in life, in an era when Italians regarded Spaniards with considerable suspicion. But the Borgia family had already established ties to the church in Rome before Rodrigo was born. His maternal uncle, Alfonso Borgia, had served as Pope Calixtus III from 1455 to 1458, and when his uncle became pope, he immediately brought his nephew Rodrigo to Rome and began advancing his career at breathtaking speed. At just 25 years of age, Rodrigo Borgia was appointed a cardinal. This was extraordinarily young for such an office, and everyone knew why. It was blatant nepotism. But no one could do anything about it, because the man conferring the appointment was the Pope himself. Rodrigo took the position and handled the rest on his own terms. He was intelligent, genuinely talented in administration and diplomacy, and had no hesitation in using every means at his disposal to consolidate power and accumulate wealth. Over the next 30 years, he was one of the wealthiest and most influential cardinals in Rome, amassing a vast array of church positions that generated enormous income. He also accumulated something else: children. Canon law required all clergy, cardinals included, to remain celibate. Rodrigo Borgia observed this rule in the strictest technical sense. He never married. But he maintained open emotional and physical relationships with several women, and from those relationships, he fathered at least 7 known children. The most important woman in his life was Vannozza de Catane, a Roman woman with whom he had a relationship lasting many years and who bore him at least 4 children: Cesare, Juan, Joffre, and Lucrezia, names that would become legends and shadows haunting history. Rodrigo made no effort to conceal the existence of these children. He raised them, acknowledged them as his own, and actively planned for their futures. This was scandalous, but not entirely without precedent in the 15th century church. Many cardinals and even some popes had illegitimate children, though they generally tried to keep it quieter than Rodrigo did. When he became pope, Rodrigo Borgia would take the practice of favoritism toward his children to an entirely new level. The year 1492 was an extraordinary one in human history. In August of that year, Christopher Columbus left Spain with 3 ships and sailed westward, not knowing he was about to reach a continent unknown to Europeans. That same year, the last Muslim kingdom of Granada in Spain fell, ending nearly 8 centuries of conflict on the Iberian Peninsula. And also in 1492, a papal election took place in Rome, one that contemporaries and historians alike have described as the most brazen and shameful act of political corruption in church history. Pope Innocent VIII died in July 1492. The College of Cardinals convened to elect his successor, and from the outset, it was clear there were 2 leading candidates, Rodrigo Borgia and Giuliano della Rovere, who would later become Pope Julius II. The 2 men despised each other deeply, and the election became an unrelenting confrontation. Rodrigo Borgia produced money, a great deal of it. He sent mules loaded with gold, silver, and precious objects to the homes of individual cardinals, accompanied by promises of offices and privileges once he was elected. One surviving account describes cardinals receiving gifts and subsequently switching their votes. Giuliano della Rovere later claimed that Rodrigo Borgia had simply purchased the papal throne, and though Giuliano was his sworn enemy and therefore not the most impartial of witnesses, his account was consistent with many other sources. Rodrigo Borgia was elected pope and took the name Alexander VI. He was 61 years old, still vigorous and full of energy, and ascended the papal throne carrying all the ambition he had nurtured across 30 years as a cardinal. From the moment he took office, Alexander VI began doing what many had feared, using his authority to serve his family. His eldest son, Cesare Borgia, whom we will return to at greater length, became a cardinal at 18, despite possessing no religious vocation whatsoever. His second son, Juan, was made Duke of Gandia and given command of the papal armies. The youngest son, Joffre, was arranged into a politically advantageous marriage, and his daughter Lucrezia, who would become the most legendary figure in the family, was deployed as a political pawn to forge alliances through marriage. Lucrezia Borgia is one of the most misunderstood women in history. For centuries, she was portrayed as a poisoner, as the incestuous lover of both her father and her brother, as a cunning and dangerous creature. These accusations largely originated with the Borgia's political enemies and were embroidered further with each passing century. The reality of Lucrezia is considerably more complicated. She was arranged into 3 marriages by her father, each one serving a different political purpose. The first was annulled when that particular alliance ceased to be useful. Her second husband was murdered. Much of the evidence pointed toward her brother Cesare as the killer, though no one dared say so openly at the time. Her third marriage, to Alfonso d'Este of Ferrara, finally brought her stability, and in Ferrara, removed from her family's orbit, she became a respected patron of the arts and scholarship, living a far quieter life than history has typically assigned her. But it was her son Cesare who truly shaped and ultimately destroyed Alexander VI's legacy. Cesare Borgia was Alexander VI's most beloved son and the vessel into which his father poured every ambition and hope he harbored. Born in 1475, Cesare was extraordinarily intelligent, equally ruthless, and of such striking physical appearance that contemporaries described him as a living painting. His father appointed him cardinal at 18, but it was evident from the start that Cesare was not a man born to wear clerical robes. He wanted war, conquest, and worldly power, not religious authority. In 1498, he did something without precedent in church history. He renounced the cardinalate. Alexander VI arranged for his son to be granted the title of Duke of Valentinois by King Louis XII of France, in exchange for Alexander annulling Louis XII's marriage and permitting him to remarry, a nakedly transactional arrangement that both parties understood clearly and accepted willingly because each stood to gain from it. Armed with his new title and his father's financial backing, Cesare began conquering territories across central Italy. He was ruthless to a degree that alarmed even the most hardened figures of his day. Cities that refused to surrender faced merciless assault. Enemies and political rivals disappeared under mysterious circumstances. It was widely whispered that Cesare kept hired killers on permanent standby and that he did not hesitate to order the death of anyone who stood in his path. Niccolò Machiavelli, the greatest political thinker of the Renaissance, author of The Prince, met Cesare Borgia several times during this period and was so profoundly impressed that he later used Cesare as the ideal model for the perfect ruler in his book. In Machiavelli's eyes, Cesare was a man who understood that power demands ruthlessness when necessary and should not be constrained by moral concerns when pursuing political ends. Was this praise or condemnation? It depends entirely on how you regard politics. Alexander VI supported all of this. He provided money, troops, and political cover for whatever Cesare did. He viewed Cesare's territorial expansion as the first phase of building a Borgia state in central Italy, a legacy he could leave to his family. But for all their fascination, the stories of Cesare and Lucrezia, the banquets at the Vatican, the mysterious deaths, the act of Alexander VI with the greatest and most enduring historical consequences took place not in Italy, but in relation to lands across the ocean that most Europeans had not yet even grasped the existence of. In October 1492, Columbus set foot on land that he and everyone else at the time believed to be India, but which was in fact the Caribbean islands of the Americas. When this news reached Europe, it immediately triggered a diplomatic crisis between Spain and Portugal. The problem was that both kingdoms were actively exploring and claiming new territories, and had long disputed each other's rights over Atlantic sea routes and lands along the African coast. Columbus's voyage made this dispute more urgent than ever. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain immediately dispatched envoys to Rome, asking Alexander VI, a Spaniard, their own countryman, to confirm Spain's rights over the lands Columbus had just discovered. And Alexander VI did so, in a manner broader, bolder, and with consequences reaching far further than anyone had requested. In May 1493, he issued the bull Inter Caetera, drawing a line from the North Pole to the South Pole, positioned 100 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. All lands to the west of this line would belong to Spain. All lands to the east would belong to Portugal. With a single stroke of his pen, Alexander VI had granted Spain ownership of most of the Americas, a continent whose true scale no European yet understood. He had also granted Portugal the right to continue its expansion along Africa and its route toward India. The Portuguese were not satisfied with this arrangement and negotiated directly with Spain, leading to the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which shifted the dividing line further west, allowing Portugal to claim what would eventually become Brazil. But the legal foundation for Spain's entire colonial system in the Americas, a system that would endure for more than 3 centuries, devastate indigenous civilizations, kill millions of people, and reshape the geopolitical map of an entire continent, all of it traced back to the document Alexander VI signed in 1493. This was not an especially corrupt or self-serving act by the standards of its time. In the medieval and early modern world, it was widely accepted that the Pope, as the representative of God on earth, held the authority to assign lands inhabited by non-Christians to Christian kingdoms charged with bringing the faith to those peoples. This was the theological reasoning behind Alexander VI's bull, and in 1493 that reasoning was accepted by most Europeans as self-evident. But its consequences, viewed from the perspective of those it affected most directly, the indigenous peoples of the Americas, the Africans seized into slavery to fill the labor needs of the new colonies, were catastrophic and impossible to justify. The story of Alexander VI cannot be told without addressing the scandals that surrounded his reign, though many of them may have been exaggerated, fabricated, or embellished by enemies. Contemporary ambassadors and observers, particularly those from Italian states, recorded accounts of Vatican banquets stretching past midnight with women and wine, of the Pope sitting at table with his mistresses and his children at lavish feasts. There were also persistent rumors that many mysterious deaths in Rome during this period were connected to the Borgia family, above all to Cesare, who was suspected of using poison to eliminate rivals. This substance was called cantarella, or sometimes Borgia powder, a compound said to be capable of killing slowly or quickly, depending on the dose administered. No forensic evidence exists for any specific poisoning, since the medicine of the day was not sophisticated enough to distinguish between poisoning and ordinary illness. But the number of deaths that occurred at moments conveniently favorable to the Borgias was large enough to generate well-founded suspicion. One of those deaths was particularly shocking. In 1497, Alexander VI's second son, Juan, the Duke of Gandia, was found dead, his body pulled from the Tiber with 9 stab wounds. No one ever established with certainty who had killed Juan, but many contemporaries pointed directly at Cesare, long known to be jealous of the brother their father favored and locked in a struggle for influence with him. Alexander VI was shattered by Juan's death. By contemporary accounts, he wept for days and declared it God's punishment for his sins. But he never prosecuted Cesare, and the truth behind Juan's death was never brought to light. While Alexander VI was presiding over the Vatican in all its luxury and family scandal, in Florence, the most important city in Italy for culture and the arts, a friar named Girolamo Savonarola was delivering fiery sermons calling for repentance and reform, directly attacking the corruption of the Church and of the Pope himself. Savonarola was one of the most forceful critics of the Church in the 15th century. He accused Alexander VI of simony, of immorality, and of being unworthy of the papal office. He called for a council to be convened that would depose Alexander VI and elect a new pope. His sermons drew tens of thousands to Florence and ignited a powerful religious movement. For years, Alexander VI attempted to manage Savonarola through a combination of inducement and intimidation. He offered to make Savonarola a cardinal, an offer Savonarola rejected outright with words of contempt. He ordered Savonarola to be silent, and Savonarola was not silent. He excommunicated Savonarola, and Savonarola continued to celebrate Mass and preach as though nothing had happened. Finally, in 1498, Alexander VI allied himself with Savonarola's political enemies in Florence. Savonarola was arrested, tortured, and sentenced to death for heresy. He was hanged and his body burned in the Piazza della Signoria in Florence, the very square where only a few years earlier he had preached to crowds of tens of thousands. Alexander VI had disposed of Savonarola. But Savonarola's criticisms of the church's corruption did not die with him. They continued to spread, shared and amplified by many. And just 20 years after Savonarola's death, Martin Luther would nail his theses to the church door in Wittenberg, igniting the Protestant Reformation that Savonarola had foreshadowed. In August 1503, Alexander VI and Cesare Borgia both fell suddenly ill after attending a banquet at the villa of Cardinal Adriano Castellesi. Cesare recovered after several weeks of serious illness. Alexander VI did not. He died on August 18, 1503, at the age of 72, after 11 years as pope. Almost immediately, rumors spread that he had been poisoned, and some versions of the story went further still, claiming that he and Cesare had intended to poison Cardinal Castellesi in order to seize his wealth, but had accidentally consumed the very poison they had prepared for someone else. This story is almost too perfect, too poetically just to be entirely true, and most modern historians believe Alexander VI most likely died of malaria or another infectious disease, not poisoning. August in Rome was epidemic season, and malaria was a common cause of sudden death in the summer months. But the story of his being killed by his own poison was too compelling to disappear, and it has been retold across the centuries, perhaps because it feels like a fitting and satisfying end to his notorious life. When Alexander VI's body was brought into St. Peter's Basilica to lie in state, what happened next was recorded by multiple witnesses with varying degrees of horror. His body decomposed with extraordinary speed in the summer heat, to the point where those carrying the coffin had to struggle to fit the body inside, described as bloated, blackened, and emitting a powerful stench. Those of his era who believed in divine retribution looked upon this and saw in it evidence of God's punishment. Those of a more pragmatic disposition saw in it what modern medicine can explain entirely through climate and sanitary conditions. The death of Alexander VI immediately undid everything he had built for the Borgia family. Cesare Borgia, still not fully recovered from his illness, found that without his father, he was no longer a man to be feared. He was simply a dangerous enemy that many wished to destroy. The cities he had conquered rose up. His alliances collapsed. Old enemies regrouped. Giuliano della Rovere, the long-standing enemy of both Alexander VI and Cesare, was elected Pope Julius II. He immediately set about dismantling the Borgia legacy and pursuing Cesare. In 1504, Cesare was captured and imprisoned in Spain. In 1507, he escaped and was killed in a minor skirmish in Navarre, ending the career of the man Machiavelli had once held up as the model of the perfect ruler. Lucrezia Borgia lived out the rest of her life in Ferrara in relative peace and respectability, dying in 1519 following the birth of her 10th child. The Borgia family, once the most powerful in Italy, vanished from the European political stage with astonishing speed. Looking back at Alexander VI from a distance of more than 500 years, the hardest thing is to assess him fairly. He was clearly a man of deep sin by the standards of the very church he led. He fathered illegitimate children and favored them brazenly. He most likely purchased the papal throne. He used the church's wealth and authority to serve his family's ambitions. He remained silent or complicit in the crimes Cesare committed under the family banner. But he was also a man of genuine ability. He was a skilled diplomat, successfully navigating the complex relationships between Italian and European powers across 11 years. He preserved the independence of the papal territories during a period when Italy was becoming a battleground between France and Spain. And the bull Inter Caetera, however catastrophic its consequences for the indigenous peoples of the Americas, was a decisive act that prevented a war between the two greatest maritime powers of the day. The more important question about Alexander VI is not whether he was good or bad. The answer is plainly that he was both, with the bad accounting for a considerable share. The more important question is, how was it possible for a man like him to ascend to and hold the papal throne for 11 years? And the answer to that question concerns not Alexander VI alone. It concerns the entire system of the 15th century church, in which power, money, and political connections could elevate anyone to any position, regardless of whether they deserved it. The existence of Alexander VI was proof that the church needed reform, and that reform, when it came, would not be a gentle correction from within, but a seismic event that shook the entire foundation of the Catholic Church and divided the Christian world in two, permanently. That seismic event was called the Protestant Reformation, and its seeds were sown not only by Martin Luther in Wittenberg, but also by what took place in the Vatican under Alexander VI. Chapter 8. Pope Julius II, the Pope who rode into battle in armor and left behind immortal masterpieces. Picture this scene. A 60-year-old man in gleaming armor, lance in hand, on horseback at the head of an army, marching into a city that has just opened its gates in surrender. Around him, the sound of war drums, the thunder of hooves, the shouts of soldiers. He's not sitting safely back in a command tent. He's at the very front of the column, face flushed with excitement, silver beard streaming in the winter wind. That man is not a general, not a king. He is the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church, the one considered the representative of Christ on earth, who by all expectation should be seated in a church in prayer rather than charging across a battlefield. But Pope Julius II was not a man who sat still. Never had been. And he had no intention of starting now. That same man, the one who rode into battle in armor, who commanded artillery laying siege to cities whom soldiers called Il Papa Terribile, was also the man who placed his hand on the shoulder of a painter named Michelangelo and said, "Paint the ceiling of my chapel." And from that came one of the greatest works of art the human hand has ever produced. Julius II is the most vivid living contradiction in the history of the Church. Warrior and patron of the arts, ruthless on the battlefield and possessed of the most refined aesthetic sensibility of his age. A pope who wielded the sword to defend what he believed was sacred and the paintbrush to create beauty for all time. His story is the story of a man who lived entirely according to his own instincts and ambitions, and who, in the course of doing so, left behind artistic and architectural treasures that no one can ever take away. Giuliano della Rovere, Julius II's birth name, was born in 1443 in Albisola, a small coastal town in the Ligurian region of northern Italy. His family was not among the highest nobility, but it possessed one important advantage. His maternal uncle was Pope Sixtus IV, who reigned from 1471 to 1484. Just as Rodrigo Borgia had been elevated by his uncle Pope Calixtus III, Giuliano della Rovere was brought into the system by his uncle Sixtus IV. By the age of 28, he was already a cardinal, and from that point, he began building power with the patience and determination of a man who knew exactly what he wanted and was willing to wait for it. But to understand Julius II, one must understand his enmity with Rodrigo Borgia, the man who would become Alexander VI. The two men had despised each other from early on, and that hatred was not the mild kind that politicians typically conceal behind polished words. This was genuine, deep, and undisguised hostility. They competed against each other in every papal election, each working to defeat the other by every means available. In 1492, when Rodrigo Borgia purchased the papal throne and became Alexander VI, Giuliano della Rovere understood that he was in danger. He fled Italy and spent 11 years in exile in France during Alexander VI's reign, residing at the courts of kings Charles VIII and Louis XII, building alliances and waiting. Throughout those years, he never stopped conspiring against Alexander VI, lobbying the French to intervene in Italy, supporting the enemies of the Borgias, and doing everything in his power to undermine the pontificate he despised. When Alexander VI died in 1503, Giuliano della Rovere returned to Rome at once. Alexander's successor, Pope Pius III, survived only 26 days on the throne before dying of illness. In the election that followed, Giuliano della Rovere was elected in record time, after just a day and a half, with near unanimous support. One reason for the speed of his election was that he had made promises to Cesare Borgia, who was still powerful and dangerous at the time, guaranteeing that the Borgia family's positions and wealth would be preserved. Cesare believed those promises and voted in his favor. That was a foolish mistake on Cesare's part, and Julius II did not take long to demonstrate that pre-election promises have a very short shelf life. Julius II did not spend much time on diplomatic niceties. He acted. In his very first weeks, he began dismantling the entire power structure Alexander VI had built for the Borgias. Cesare Borgia, who still controlled significant territories in central Italy, quickly found that Julius II's promises were worthless. He was stripped of his offices, deprived of papal protection, and eventually forced to flee Italy. Julius II also ordered all images and symbols of the Borgia family removed from the Vatican rooms, a historically regrettable act of erasure, since it also destroyed many works of artistic value. The suite of rooms later known as the Borgia Apartments, adorned with frescoes by Pinturicchio, was sealed shut by Julius II and left abandoned for the duration of his reign. He refused to live in rooms that his enemy had inhabited. Instead, he moved into an upper floor of the Apostolic Palace and ordered the new rooms there to be decorated. The artist he chose for this task was a young painter from Urbino named Raphael Sanzio, and what Raphael created in those rooms would forever be known as the Raphael Rooms, an immortal legacy of Julius II in the history of art. But before reaching that part of the story, Julius II had a great deal of war to wage. Julius II came to power with one clear, unwavering objective that defined his entire reign: to reclaim and defend the territories belonging to the Church, the papal states of central Italy, that had been seized by local noble families and foreign powers during the chaotic decades before him. This was not purely personal ambition, or at least not only that. Julius II believed that the Church required an independent territorial base in order to function without dependence on any secular power. If the Pope had no land or income of his own, he would become a puppet in the hands of whoever controlled Rome, precisely what had happened during the Babylonian captivity in Avignon a century earlier. To pursue that goal, Julius II did something few popes had dared. He went to war himself. The first campaign came in 1506, targeting the cities of Bologna and Perugia, two important cities under the control of local noble families who refused to acknowledge papal supremacy. Julius II did not merely send his armies ahead of him. He rode alongside them in armor, wearing an iron helmet, looking more like a general than a pope. Perugia surrendered without a fight upon hearing that the Pope was personally leading the advance. Bologna held out somewhat longer, but eventually capitulated as well. When Julius II rode into Bologna in the posture of a conqueror, the crowds lining the streets watched in a mixture of astonishment and awe. No one had seen a pope lead a victorious army in quite this way for a very long time. Erasmus of Rotterdam, the greatest humanist scholar of the day, renowned for the sharpness of his satire, happened to be in Bologna and witnessed the spectacle. He later wrote a satirical piece titled Julius Excluded from Heaven, in which he imagined Julius II arriving at the gates of heaven after his death, lance still in hand, and still issuing commands to St. Peter to open the gates, only to be turned away on account of his sins of war. It is one of the sharpest pieces of papal criticism written in the 16th century, and it shows that even those who admired Julius II found something unsettling and strange in the image of a pope in armor. But Bologna and Perugia were merely the opening act. Julius II's real war was with Venice, the wealthiest commercial republic in Italy, a power that had exploited the years of instability to seize a number of territories belonging to the Church. Venice was a uniquely difficult adversary. Militarily, it possessed the most powerful navy in the Mediterranean. Economically, it was rich enough to hire whatever army it needed. Politically, it had endured as an independent republic for centuries and had allies everywhere. Julius II recognized that the Church could not defeat Venice alone. He needed allies, and he went about finding them in a manner quite uncharacteristic of a pope. He assembled an anti-Venice coalition from powers that had no natural affinity for one another: France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Church, all brought together because each wanted a piece of Venetian territory. The League of Cambrai of 1508 was one of Julius II's finest diplomatic achievements. He persuaded King Louis XII of France, Emperor Maximilian I of the Holy Roman Empire, and King Ferdinand II of Spain to attack Venice simultaneously. In May 1509, the Allied forces crushed Venice at the Battle of Agnadello, one of the worst defeats in the history of the Venetian Republic. Most of the mainland territories Venice had seized were recovered, and Venice came close to being wiped out entirely as a power. Julius II recovered the church lands he was after, mission accomplished. And then, at that very moment, he did something that left all his allies speechless. He reversed the alliance entirely. Recognizing that the French military presence in northern Italy was growing too large and too dangerous for Italy's independence, Julius II began negotiating with Venice itself, the enemy he had just defeated, and built a new coalition against France. He made peace with Venice, lifted the religious penalties he had imposed on them, and began campaigning against the French with the same energy he had directed against Venice only months before. The Holy League of 1511, comprising the Church, Venice, Spain, England, and the Holy Roman Empire, was formed with a single purpose: to drive the French out of Italy. Its rallying cry, said to have been coined by Julius II himself, was three words, simple and sharp: Fuori I barbari, drive out the barbarians. This was diplomacy at the highest level. Julius II had used the great European powers as chess pieces, assembling and reassembling them against one another in whatever configuration served the interests of the Church and of Italy. He was not as strong as the French or the Spanish militarily, but he was shrewd enough to ensure he never had to fight alone. Not all of Julius II's campaigns ended in success, however, and not everything could be resolved through diplomacy. In January 1511, Julius II personally commanded the siege of the city of Mirandola, a small but strategically important fortress in northern Italy then held by French forces. He was 67 years old, tormented by gout so severe that he was sometimes unable to walk, and the winter that year in northern Italy was especially brutal, with heavy snow and biting cold. Those around him begged him to remain behind, safely in camp. Julius II would not hear of it. He was carried in a chair as close as possible to the city walls, within range of the enemy's artillery, and from there directed the battle, face red with fury and excitement, silver beard bristling in the cold wind. A cannonball fired from within the city landed not far from where he sat. His attendants cried out for him to fall back. Julius II looked at where the shot had landed, looked back at the walls, and ordered the bombardment to continue. When Mirandola finally fell, Julius II entered the city not through the main gate, blocked by snow, but through a breach in the wall torn open by his own artillery. He climbed through that gap, entered the newly conquered city, and stood watching as the papal banner was raised over the tower. This is an image that contemporaries could neither forget nor fully comprehend. A pope, nearly 70 years old, ill, climbing through a shell-blasted hole in a wall in the snow to enter a city taken by force. What does that say about Julius II? Extraordinary courage? Inconceivable arrogance? Or simply the instinct of a man born to act, constitutionally incapable of sitting still even when the whole world told him he must? Perhaps all of those things at once. But Julius II was not only a warrior, and this is what makes him one of the most complex and compelling figures in history. The same man who rode into battle in armor also made one of the most consequential architectural decisions in human history: the demolition of the old St. Peter's Basilica and the construction of an entirely new one in its place. The old St. Peter's had stood in Rome since the time of the Emperor Constantine, more than 1,000 years before. It was one of the oldest and most sacred churches in the Christian world, a site of pilgrimage for millions of the faithful across the centuries. To tear it down was an act that many considered an unforgivable desecration of a sacred heritage. But Julius II looked at that 1,000-year-old structure and saw a building rotting away, lacking grandeur, unworthy of the church he represented. He wanted to build something greater, a monument that would declare to the entire world that the Catholic Church was not a fading institution, but an eternal force. In 1505, he he commissioned the design of the new St. Peter's Basilica from the architect Donato Bramante, considered the greatest architect in Italy at the time. Bramante proposed a bold design in the form of a Greek cross with an enormous central dome, drawing inspiration from the ancient Roman Pantheon, but on a far grander and more magnificent scale. In April 1506, Julius II personally laid the first foundation stone of the new St. Peter's Basilica. That was the day Rome began its slow transformation into the city we see today. St. Peter's was not completed during Julius II's lifetime. The immense project would require more than 120 years and a succession of architects, including Michelangelo himself, to bring to completion. But the idea, the decision, and the first stone, all of these came from Julius II. No account of Julius II can be complete without telling the story of his relationship with Michelangelo Buonarroti, and no relationship in the history of art has produced greater masterpieces or generated more conflict and confrontation than the one between these two men. When Julius II came to power, Michelangelo was already the most celebrated sculptor in Italy, thanks to the Pietà and the David, two works that had compelled the world to acknowledge a rare and singular genius. Julius II immediately wanted to harness that genius for his own purposes. The first project was an enormous tomb for Julius II himself, a grand sculptural monument of multiple tiers with dozens of colossal figures to be installed in the new St. Peter's Basilica. Michelangelo threw himself into the project with enthusiasm. He traveled to Carrara, the mountainous region famous for producing the finest white marble in the world, and spent months personally selecting and overseeing the quarrying of stone. But then Julius II abruptly changed his plans and stopped receiving Michelangelo altogether. No explanation was given. The palace doors simply closed in the artist's face. Michelangelo, famous for his fierce temper and towering pride, was not prepared to endure this humiliation. He left Rome and returned to Florence without permission, abandoning the expensive marble in his contract with the Pope. Julius II erupted in fury and sent messengers after him demanding he return. Michelangelo refused. Julius II sent more messengers with increasingly stern language. Michelangelo still did not return. This is one of the rare episodes in history where an artist dared to defy the most powerful patron in the world, and for a time, actually prevailed. The reconciliation eventually took place in Bologna, where Julius II was stationed following a successful military campaign. Michelangelo came to meet the Pope ready for a fight, and Julius II, rather than punishing him, forgave him and offered him a new project. That project was the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo did not want to do it. He was a sculptor, not a painter, or at least that was how he defined himself. He had built his reputation with the David and the Pietà, works carved from marble. Painting a mural on a chapel ceiling was an entirely different discipline, the technique of fresco, which required painting rapidly on wet plaster before it dried, with no room for corrections once the surface set. And painting overhead, neck craned back for hours at a stretch, was physically punishing work. He also suspected this was a scheme by rivals who wanted to see him fail. If the result fell short, his reputation would be ruined. But Julius II did not accept no for an answer. He was patient, in his own particular way, not the patience of someone who can wait indefinitely, but the patience of someone who keeps pushing until the other person relents. Michelangelo relented, and one of the most extraordinary creative journeys in the history of art began. From 1508 to 1512, 4 years, Michelangelo worked on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. He designed his own scaffolding system, dissatisfied with what others had proposed. He dismissed nearly all of his assistants after concluding they were not good enough. He did most of the work himself. The painted surface is estimated at around 500 square meters, containing more than 300 life-sized figures. The working conditions were brutal. He labored for many hours each day with his neck bent back, plaster dripping into his eyes and onto his skin, the light poor from candles. He ate little, slept little, and barely left the building for the duration of those years. His health deteriorated considerably. Julius II was not a conventional patron. He frequently climbed the scaffolding to check on progress, asked when it would be finished, and on occasion, out of impatience, struck Michelangelo with his staff when dissatisfied with the pace. Michelangelo endured this with something less than grace, and his letters from that period are filled with complaints about his difficult patron. But what did that tense, combative relationship between two supremely stubborn men produce? On October 31st, 1512, the Sistine Chapel opened to the public for the first time in 4 years. Julius II walked in and raised his eyes to the ceiling. What he saw, and what the world has seen ever since, is the greatest fresco in the history of human art. 9 scenes from the book of Genesis spanning the length of the ceiling, from God separating light from darkness to the drunkenness of Noah. At the center is the most famous image of all, the hand of God and the hand of Adam, separated by the smallest of gaps, 2 fingers on the verge of touching in the moment of the giving of life. Julius II said nothing when he looked up. Those around him recorded that he stood for a long time, in silence, his head tilted back. Perhaps even he sensed that what hung above him surpassed anything that any patron, himself included, could truly claim credit for. While Michelangelo was locked in his battle with the Sistine ceiling, another artistic revolution was unfolding just 1 floor above in the Apostolic Palace. Raphael Sanzio, the artist Julius II had chosen to decorate his private rooms, was in almost every respect the perfect counterpoint to Michelangelo. Michelangelo was solitary, difficult, self-tormenting, and approached art as a form of spiritual struggle. Raphael was sociable, agreeable, beloved by everyone, and produced beauty with a grace and ease that made it seem to viewers as though no effort lay behind what they saw. Raphael was just 25 years old when Julius II gave him the commission to decorate his rooms. But when Julius II and his advisors saw Raphael's first works, they recognized a genius immediately, and Julius II extended the commission to cover the entire floor. The most famous work Raphael created in those rooms is the School of Athens, a vast fresco depicting the greatest philosophers of antiquity gathered in a magnificent architectural space, engaged in debate and discussion. Plato and Aristotle stand at the center, surrounded by sages and scholars. Raphael inserted portraits of his contemporaries among the ancient figures, and the face he chose to give Plato was that of Leonardo da Vinci, the greatest of his living peers, and Michelangelo. Raphael painted him, alone, seated apart from the crowd, bent over his writing in a posture of melancholy and solitude, as Heraclitus, the ancient philosopher famous for his dark temperament. It is a remarkable piece of psychological portraiture. Raphael, who knew Michelangelo, chose for him a figure that fits the man with uncanny precision. In 1511, Julius II faced a different kind of threat, not from secular rulers or enemy armies, but from within the Church itself. King Louis XII of France, engaged in open conflict with Julius II, sought to turn the Church's own instruments against the Pope. He funded a group of disaffected cardinals who convened a council at Pisa, a gathering that declared itself empowered to judge and even depose the Pope. This was the nightmare of any pope. The idea that a council of bishops held authority superior to the papacy, the doctrine known as conciliarism. If the Council of Pisa were recognized as legitimate, it would establish a dangerous precedent for the future. Julius II struck back by convening a council of his own, the Fifth Lateran Council in Rome in 1512, while simultaneously declaring the Pisan gathering invalid and excommunicating all the cardinals who had taken part in it. The Fifth Lateran Council continued after Julius II's death, eventually concluding in 1517, the very year, by notable coincidence, that Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg. The council missed its opportunity to carry out the substantive reforms that might have prevented or softened the Protestant Reformation, but that belongs to the story of Julius II's successors, not his own. Julius II began to fail in his health toward the end of 1512. The years of campaigning in harsh conditions, combined with age and chronic illness, finally overcame even his extraordinary will. He died on February 21, 1513, just a few months after the Sistine ceiling was unveiled. He was 69 years old. Those at his side in his final hours reported that he was still speaking of plans for the new St. Peter's, of territories yet to be reclaimed, of enemies still to be dealt with. He was a man incapable of fading gradually. Even as his body collapsed, his mind was still planning, still fighting. The tomb he had commissioned Michelangelo to create for him was never completed according to its original design. The project was scaled back many times over the decades after Julius II's death. The statue of Moses, one of Michelangelo's greatest sculptural achievements, made for the Julius tomb, still stands today in the Church of San Pietro in Vincoli in Rome, gazing down at visitors with the wrathful, commanding eyes that Michelangelo imprisoned in marble. Julius II reigned for only 10 years, far shorter than many of the other popes in this story. But no pope in 10 years left a greater mark on the physical and artistic face of Rome and of the world. He was not a holy man. He fathered illegitimate children as Alexander VI had, though fewer and less openly. He went to war with an enthusiasm that many contemporaries and later observers considered incompatible with the office of pope. Erasmus was not alone in looking at Julius II and seeing an irreconcilable contradiction between the man and the ideals of the position he held. But he was also the man who defended and expanded the Church's territories, securing the independence of the Holy See during an exceptionally dangerous period. He was the man who commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine ceiling and Raphael to decorate the Vatican rooms. He was the man who laid the first stone of the new St. Peter's Basilica. He was the man who brought Bramante, Raphael, and Michelangelo, the three greatest geniuses of the Renaissance, to work in the same city. In the same era, producing a concentration of art and architecture the world had never seen before, and will perhaps never see again. Today, when millions of people each year come to Rome, tilt their heads back to look up at the Sistine ceiling, walk across St. Peter's Square, and stand beneath the immense dome of the Basilica, gaze at Raphael's frescoes in the Vatican rooms, everything they see bears the fingerprints of Julius II. He did not create those things. The geniuses he employed created them. But without Julius II, none of those works would exist. Art history tends to remember the creators. Julius II was the one who commanded and commissioned, the one without whose decisions and resources Michelangelo might have spent his entire life carving stone rather than painting ceilings. Raphael might have painted small devotional pictures in small churches, and the dome of St. Peter's might never have risen. That is the legacy of the warrior pope, the man who rode into battle in armor and left behind masterpieces for all time. The man so stubborn that even Michelangelo, the proudest and most difficult artist of his age, could not ultimately resist his will. The man who lived with ferocious intensity to his very last breath, and in that intensity left behind for humanity treasures beyond all measure. Chapter 9. Pope Pius IX, the longest reigning pope in history and the man who watched everything fall apart. There are people to whom history grants long life, not for enjoyment, but for witnessing. To sit upon a throne day after day, year after year, and watch the familiar world they knew crumble piece by piece, while lacking the power to stop it and the will to let it go. Pius IX was such a man. He reigned for 31 years and 7 months, longer than any pope in history, and according to Catholic tradition, longer even than St. Peter is said to have led the first Christian community in Rome. In those 31 years, he proclaimed the most significant theological dogmas in centuries, convened the First Vatican Council, one of the most important events in church history, and redefined the role of the Pope in ways no one before him had dared. But in those same 31 years, he lost all of the church's territories. He watched a temporal empire that popes had governed for more than 1,000 years vanish in the space of less than a decade. He became a prisoner within his own palace, or more precisely, he confined himself there and called himself a prisoner in protest against a world that was changing in ways he could not accept. This is the story of a man who began as a progressive reformer celebrated across Europe and ended as the very symbol of the most obstinate conservatism. And both of those images are true. Both are genuinely him, separated only by a few years and a handful of fateful events. Giovanni Maria Mastai Ferretti, Pius IX's birth name, was born on May 13, 1792, in Senigallia, a small coastal town in the Marche region of central Italy. He was the ninth child in a minor provincial noble family, not especially wealthy, not especially influential, but with enough standing to ensure their children received a decent education. From childhood, Giovanni suffered from a serious medical condition. He was epileptic, subject to periodic seizures that prevented him from taking part in many of the ordinary activities of his peers. In the 19th century, epilepsy was both a medical condition and a social stigma. People understood very little about its causes, had no effective treatment for it, and many superstitiously regarded it as a sign of something demonic or supernatural. It was precisely because of his epilepsy that Giovanni was initially refused entry into the noble guard of the Pope, a prestigious position that many young Italian noblemen aspired to. That rejection, painful as it was, redirected the course of his life. He applied to the seminary and pursued a religious vocation. And there, something remarkable happened. The seizures gradually diminished and eventually ceased altogether. Giovanni, and those around him, believed this to be a miracle, clear evidence that God had healed him and was pointing him toward a path. That belief, that his life had a divine purpose, that God had intervened directly in his fate, would stay with him to the end of his days and explains many of the remarkable decisions he made in later years. A man who believes he has been healed and appointed by God does not easily change direction when the world tells him he must. After his ordination as a priest in 1819, Giovanni Mastai Ferretti began climbing the rungs of the church at a steady but unremarkable pace, enough to show he had ability, but not the kind of man who advanced through scheming or connections. One of the most formative periods of his early career was a journey to South America from 1823 to 1825, when he accompanied the papal envoy to Chile and Peru, two countries that had just won independence from Spain and were in the midst of turbulent transition. That journey broadened Giovanni's horizons well beyond the narrow confines of Italy and Europe. He encountered Christian communities in distant lands, grappling with problems and challenges entirely unlike those familiar to the European Church. He learned that the Church was not merely the story of Rome and Europe. It was a global institution with dimensions that those sitting in the Vatican could barely imagine. Returning to Italy, he continued his ecclesiastical career, being ordained a bishop in 1827, then archbishop, then cardinal in 1840. At each position, he was recognized as enthusiastic, diligent, close to the people, and genuinely compassionate, not the performative charity that many in the church practiced to appear virtuous, but a real concern for those who suffered and lacked. He was also known for a volatile temper, quick to flare, and equally quick to cool, and in the aftermath of anger, inclined to reproach himself for having lost his composure. This character trait would surface repeatedly in the most consequential decisions of his later years. When Pope Gregory XVI died in June 1846, Italy and Europe were in a state of political ferment. Across the continent, nationalist and liberal movements were stirring. People wanted governmental reform, constitutions, freedom of the press and speech, and Italian unification into a single nation rather than a peninsula divided into dozens of small kingdoms under various noble dynasties and partly under Austrian control. Gregory XVI, Pius IX's predecessor, had been an extremely conservative pope who used every means at his disposal to suppress reform movements and preserve the old order. He despised railways to the point of calling them roads to hell and refused to permit their construction in the Papal States. So when Giovanni Mastai Ferretti, known for his more moderate views and his genuine warmth, was elected Pope Pius IX, Italy erupted in near jubilation. In Rome, people flooded into the streets to celebrate. In Turin, Milan, Florence, Naples, across the entire peninsula, people spoke of the Papa Liberale, the liberal pope, with the conviction that here at last was the man who would lead the Church in Italy into a new era. And the first months of Pius IX's pontificate seemed to confirm that hope. Pius IX's first act as pope was to issue an amnesty for hundreds of political prisoners held in the jails of the Papal States. men arrested for their involvement in liberal and nationalist movements. They were released, allowed to go home, reunited with their families. The news spread like electricity. In Rome, people sang his name in the streets. Across Italy, he was hailed as a savior. Some even called him the Pope of the Republic, a phrase that sounded utterly contradictory with his office, but captured the extent of the hopes being placed in him. He pressed on with further reforms. He permitted the establishment of a consultative assembly that included lay people. For the first time in history, non-clergy had a formal role in advising the papal government. He relaxed press censorship. He extended certain civil rights to the Jews of Rome, though still very limited by modern standards. He began exploring the possibility of Italian unification, with the Papal States as a participant. Liberals across Europe were thrilled. A pope in favor of reform, this could change everything. Poets, writers, and revolutionaries wrote of Pius IX as the herald of a new age. Then, 1848 arrived, and everything collapsed. The year 1848 was the year of revolution across Europe. From Paris to Vienna, from Berlin to Budapest, people rose up demanding political reform, constitutions, and national self-determination. The spirit of revolution swept the entire continent like a storm. In Italy, the movement for national unification, the Risorgimento, flared with new intensity. People wanted the Austrians driven out of northern Italy, the peninsula unified, and the Pope to lead a new federation of Italian states. The expectation was that Pius IX, the liberal Pope, would declare war on Austria and head the movement for Italian unification. But Pius IX could not do that, and the reason he could not reflects a fundamental contradiction in his position that admitted no resolution. As Pope, the spiritual leader of all Catholics in the world, including Austrians, he could not declare war on another Catholic nation. Millions of Catholic Austrians, Belgians, Poles, and people across the world were also his flock. How could he call upon Italian Catholics to kill Austrian Catholics? In an address in April 1848, Pius IX made plain that he could not go to war against Austria. This was an entirely coherent decision from a religious standpoint, but to Italians burning with nationalist fervor, it was an unforgivable betrayal. In November 1848, Pius IX's prime minister, a man named Pellegrino Rossi, one of his most capable officials, was assassinated on the steps of the Parliament building. His killer belonged to the Italian revolutionary movement. No one was arrested. No one was prosecuted. And the crowd surrounding the site of the murder broke into laughter. That was the moment Pius IX looked out at the world and saw what he had once believed to be progressive reform transformed into a storm of violence he could not control. A month later, he fled Rome in disguise, dressed as an ordinary priest, his face concealed, climbing into the Bavarian ambassador's carriage and leaving the city under cover of darkness. He took refuge in Gaeta, under the protection of King Ferdinand II of Naples. The Pope, the supreme religious leader of the Catholic world, was a fugitive, watching Rome from a distance as revolutionaries established the Roman Republic in his absence. Pius IX returned to Rome in April 1850, after French troops, dispatched by Napoleon III to forestall Austrian influence, crushed the Roman Republic and restored papal authority. But the man who returned to Rome in 1850 was not the man who had left in 1848. The humiliating flight in the dark of night, 18 months of exile, and what he had seen the revolution do to the order he held sacred, all of it had changed him profoundly. He now believed that liberal reform, what he had undertaken in the first 2 years of his pontificate, had been a mistake. The concessions to the spirit of the age led only to chaos and violence, that the Church needed to stand firm against modern currents rather than try to accommodate them. This was the most important psychological and theological turning point in the life of Pius IX. And from that turning point, every significant decision of the remaining 30 years of his reign would flow. Syllabus of Errors, a list of 80 mistakes of the modern world. In 1864, Pius IX issued a document known as the Syllabus Errorum, or the Syllabus of Errors. It was a list of 80 propositions that Pius IX declared to be false and deserving of rejection. Reading through that list, one sees a clear portrait of everything Pius IX opposed in the contemporary world. political liberalism, socialism, communism, Freemasonry, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, the separation of church and state, and the idea that the Pope should reconcile himself with progress, liberalism, and modern civilization. That final item, proposition number 80, framed as something to be rejected. The Roman pontiff can and should reconcile himself with progress, liberalism, and modern civilization, is the most quoted and most contested line in the document. By placing it among the things to be condemned, Pius IX made clear that he had no intention of doing so. The Syllabus Aurorum provoked a storm of reaction across Europe. The governments of several countries, including Catholic ones like France and Bavaria, banned the document from circulating within their territories. Liberal thinkers were outraged. Even many Catholics were bewildered and at a loss to defend the Pope against the criticism. But Pius IX did not care. He believed he was defending the truth, and the truth did not require anyone's applause. A decade before the Syllabus Aurorum, in 1854, Pius IX had done something no pope had dared to do in centuries. He proclaimed a new dogma by his own authority alone, without convening a council. That dogma was the Immaculate Conception, the teaching that the Virgin Mary, Mother of Jesus, was conceived without original sin from the very first moment of her existence in her mother's womb. This was not a new idea in the Church. Theologians had debated it for centuries, and many of the faithful had long held it as a matter of personal devotion. But it had never been formally defined as a dogma, that is, as something every Catholic was required to believe. What made the moment historically significant was not the theological content of the dogma, but the manner in which Pius IX proclaimed it. He did not convene a council of bishops to deliberate and vote. He simply declared it by his own authority as the successor of St. Peter. This was a foreshadowing and a rehearsal for what he would do 16 years later at the First Vatican Council, declaring that the Pope possessed the authority to define doctrine alone without needing the consent of anyone else. In 1869, Pius IX convened the First Vatican Council, the largest event in church history since the Council of Trent 3 centuries before. More than 700 bishops from around the world converged on Rome, passed through the immense doors of St. Peter's Basilica, and took their seats in long rows to deliberate on the future of the Church. The agenda was broad. Many theological and disciplinary questions required attention, but everyone knew there was one central issue that would determine everything else: the doctrine of papal infallibility. This doctrine held that when the Pope makes a formal pronouncement on a matter of faith or morals, what is called ex cathedra, meaning from his throne, that pronouncement cannot be in error. Not in the sense that the Pope is personally perfect or without sin, but in the sense that when he speaks in the most formal manner on matters of faith and morals, the Holy Spirit protects him from error. This was not an entirely new idea. It had been discussed in the Church for centuries, but it had never been proposed as an official dogma, and the proposal to make it one at the First Vatican Council ignited one of the fiercest debates in the history of the modern Church. Supporters, known as infallibilists, argued that this had always been true in the Church's practice and needed only to be formally declared. They pointed to what Pius IX had already done in practice when he proclaimed the dogma of the Immaculate Conception in 1854 without a council. Opponents, a significant minority of around 1/5 of the bishops, had two distinct lines of objection. Some objected on theological grounds. They believed the authority to define doctrine belonged to the whole Church through councils, not to one individual. Others did not dispute the correctness of the doctrine itself, but argued that the timing was wrong. In the prevailing political climate, so sensitive and volatile, such a declaration would provoke further misunderstanding and opposition. The debate within the council was intense and dragged on for months. Opposing bishops wrote directly to Pius IX, imploring him to withdraw the proposal or at least postpone it. Pius IX did not relent. On the day of the final vote, July 18, 1870, approximately 60 bishops who opposed the measure had already left Rome beforehand, unwilling either to vote against the Pope or to vote in favor of something they did not believe. Of the more than 600 bishops who remained, 533 voted in favor, 2 abstained, and only 2 voted against. Pius IX rose and solemnly proclaimed the doctrine of papal infallibility as an official dogma of the Catholic Church. At that very moment, a storm broke over St. Peter's Basilica. Thunder and torrential rain lashed Rome. Those present later recounted that something strange and inexplicable hung over that instant. Lightning blazed across the sky just as the declaration was read aloud. Believers saw in it the hand of God, skeptics saw coincidence, and those who had opposed the measure saw in it an ill omen. But history did not give Pius IX much time to savor his theological triumph. The day after the First Vatican Council adopted papal infallibility, July 19, 1870, France declared war on Prussia, beginning the Franco-Prussian War. And since France was the only power maintaining troops in Rome to protect the Papal States from the Italian army seeking to unify the peninsula, this meant the French forces had to withdraw to fight on home soil. Rome was suddenly without a defender. The army of the Kingdom of Italy, the newly established state founded in 1861 under King Victor Emmanuel II, which had already unified most of the Italian peninsula, had long been waiting for this moment. With no French troops, there was no longer any reason to wait. On September 20th, 1870, Italian forces entered Rome after artillery breached the ancient city walls at the Porta Pia. The occupation was over in less than a day. Pius IX had ordered his small garrison to offer only token resistance, to demonstrate that he was not yielding willingly, and then to lay down arms to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. The Papal States, the territory the Pope had governed for more than 1,000 years, since Pope Stephen II and the Frankish King Pippin in the 8th century, ceased to exist as a political entity in fewer than 12 hours. Pius IX sat in the Vatican Palace and listened to the sound of gunfire. He was at prayer when the news arrived. Rome had fallen. The Papal States were lost. He was a pope without a country. Those present with him later recorded that he did not cry out, did not rage, did not weep. He sat in silence for a moment, then spoke a sentence those around him set down. Fiat voluntas tua. Thy will be done. But it was not true acceptance. It was the acceptance of a man who was waiting, who believed that God would intervene, would reverse everything, would restore what had been lost. The Italian government offered to negotiate with Pius IX. They proposed that the Pope retain the Vatican City and several surrounding areas as his own sovereign territory, guaranteeing him complete freedom and independence, and paying the Church an annual financial compensation to make up for the lost revenues of the Papal States. This was, in fact, a fairly generous offer, given that one state had just occupied another's territory. But Pius IX refused it entirely. He declared himself the prisoner of the Vatican and refused to step outside the boundaries of Vatican City for the rest of his life. He refused to recognize the Kingdom of Italy. He refused to accept a single lira from the Italian government. He forbade Italian Catholics from participating in the elections or political life of the Kingdom of Italy, a prohibition known as non expedite. It is not appropriate that persisted for decades and had a profound effect on Italian political life. This was a strong and principled act of protest, but it was also an impractical one, because in reality, Pius IX had no power to change the situation. He could not retake Rome by force. He could not compel the European powers to intervene and restore the Papal States. He could only protest, and he protested in silence and solitude through the months and years that remained to him. Throughout the pontificate of Pius IX, one event in particular drew a wave of criticism not only from secularists, but from many Catholics as well. The Mortara affair. In 1858, in Bologna, at that time still part of the Papal States, a 6-year-old Jewish boy named Edgardo Mortara was taken from his family home by papal guards and brought to Rome. The reason? A Catholic servant girl employed by the family had secretly baptized the child when he was very young and gravely ill, fearing he would die without baptism. Under church law at the time, a baptized child was a Catholic and could not be raised by non-Catholic parents. Edgardo's parents pleaded for their son's return. Jews across Europe protested. Political leaders from Napoleon III to Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria wrote to Pius IX demanding the child be returned to his family. Pius IX refused. He genuinely loved Edgardo, in his own way. The boy was placed in an institute in Rome, educated in the Catholic faith, and Pius IX took a personal interest in his education and development. Edgardo later became a Catholic priest and lived to old age, never returning to his family and never renouncing his Catholic faith. But whatever Edgardo's personal fate, whatever Pius IX believed about having saved the child's soul, the act of removing a 6-year-old from his parents and keeping him there while the whole world demanded his release is something that many people, both then and now, have found impossible to forgive. The Mortara case stands as evidence that Pius IX, despite genuine compassion in many other circumstances, could not see the boundary between defending a principle and inflicting real suffering on real human beings. For the last 8 years of his life, Pius IX lived within the Vatican as the prisoner he had chosen to become, never crossing the boundary he had drawn for himself. The Rome around him was becoming the capital of a new nation, alive with the political and social activity of a unified Italy. But Pius IX looked out his window and did not see that. He saw only an illegal occupation, a world's betrayal of God and the Church. His health declined gradually from the early 1870s. He continued to work, to receive visitors, to write letters, but at a slower pace and with diminishing strength. Those around him described an old man whose eyes still sharpened and whose mind remained clear, but whose body grew ever more frail. One thing many observers recorded was that he retained his sense of humor and personal warmth even in his final years. He could explode in fierce anger over politics or theology, but with the individuals he encountered directly, pilgrims, visitors, attendants, he often showed warmth and occasionally a dry wit of his own. He died on February 7, 1878, after more than 31 years on the papal throne, the longest pontificate in history, a record that has never been broken to this day. He was 85 years old and had reigned for more than half his life. Assessing Pius IX is an extraordinarily difficult task because his legacy is simultaneously clear and deeply contradictory. Theologically, his contributions are undeniable and remain profoundly influential. The dogma of the Immaculate Conception in 1854 and the doctrine of papal infallibility in 1870 represent the most significant theological contributions of any pope in centuries. The First Vatican Council he convened redefined the structure of authority in the Catholic Church in ways that remain in force to this day. But politically and socially, his pontificate was a succession of irreversible failures. He lost the Papal States. He could not stop or adapt to the political transformations reshaping Europe and the world. His Syllabus Errorum, whatever genuine theological concerns lay behind it, turned the Church into an avowed opponent of many values the modern world regards as foundational. And the Mortara case, the story of the Jewish child taken from his parents, stands as testimony to the limits of principle when severed from practical compassion. In 2000, Pope John Paul II beatified Pius IX, recognizing him as a figure of holiness. The decision met with strong objections from many quarters, particularly from the Jewish community and from many progressive Catholics who pointed to the Mortara affair and to what the Syllabus Errorum represented. The Catholic Church has maintained that decision, but the debate it continues to provoke, whether Pius IX deserves to be venerated as a saint, reflects the irresolvable complexity of both the man and his legacy. He began as a reformer, hailed across Europe. He ended as the embodiment of resistance to the modern world. He reigned longer than anyone in history, and in that reign left the most consequential theological dogmas of any pope in centuries, while losing more on the temporal plane than any of his predecessors. He was a man who believed God had healed his epilepsy and appointed him to a sacred mission, and he lived by that belief to his very last breath, never yielding, never adapting, never surrendering. Was that greatness, or was it a stubbornness that brought more suffering than good? History, as always, offers no simple answer. It only poses the question and leaves each person to find their own. Chapter 10. Pope John Paul II, the man from behind the Iron Curtain who changed the world. On October 16, 1978, White smoke rose from the small chimney above St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, the traditional signal announcing that the College of Cardinals had elected a new pope. Tens of thousands gathered in St. Peter's Square, tilted their heads upward, and waited. When Cardinal Jean-Marie Villot stepped out onto the balcony and read the name of the one chosen, the crowd responded with a strange silence lasting several seconds, not from joy or disappointment, but because no one recognized the name that had just been announced: Karol Wojtyla, a Pole, from a country behind the Iron Curtain under communist rule. This was the first time since 1523, more than 4.5 centuries, that a non-Italian had been elected pope. And not merely a non-Italian. This was a man from a country whose government regarded religion as an enemy of the state, a man who had lived and worked under 2 different totalitarian regimes, Nazi and communist, and had not been broken by either. When that man stepped out onto the balcony, looked down at the crowd, and began to speak in Italian with a clearly audible Polish accent, the entire square erupted in sustained applause and cheering. He said that the College of Cardinals had called him from a distant country, and the crowd laughed and applauded because the way he said it carried not a trace of self-deprecation, only warm humor. He said that if he made mistakes in Italian, they should correct him, and the crowd laughed even louder. Within minutes, Karol Wojtyla, John Paul II, had won the hearts of Rome, and that was only the beginning. Karol Józef Wojtyla was born on May 18, 1920, in Wadowice, a small town in southern Poland about 50 kilometers from Krakow. Poland at that time had only recently regained its independence after more than a century of partition and rule by 3 great empires: Russia, Austria, and Prussia. The country was in the midst of rebuilding itself, full of national spirit and hope. But the Wojtyla family had little time to enjoy the mood of the age. Karol was the youngest of 3 children. When he was 8 years old, his mother Amelia died of heart and kidney disease. When he was 12, his older brother Edmund, a young doctor of great promise, died of scarlet fever contracted from one of his patients. And in 1941, when Karol was 20 and Poland was under Nazi occupation, his father, Karol Sr., also departed. The young Karol came home to find his father had died alone, lying in his bed. Those present later recounted that after finding his father, Karol knelt beside the bed and prayed through the entire night. The following morning, he went to see his spiritual director and said, "Now I am alone in the world, but I'm not afraid." At 20, Karol Wojtyla had no one left. His parents were gone. His brother was gone. Poland was occupied by the most brutal regime in history. The Jewish people of the surrounding cities were being transported to concentration camps. His countrymen were being shot, tortured, and taken away into forced labor. That was the foundation upon which the man who became John Paul II was built. Not a foundation of comfort or peace, but of loss, suffering, and a faith that survived all of it. During the years of Nazi occupation in Poland from 1939 to 1945, Karol Wojtyla lived a remarkable double life. By day, he worked as a laborer, first in a stone quarry, then in a chemical plant belonging to the Solvay Corporation. This was hard, dangerous, and humiliating work for a young man who was clearly educated and gifted with literary talent. But it was the only way to hold a work permit and avoid being seized for forced labor or sent to a concentration camp. In his free time, he took part in a secret theater group, the Rhapsodic Theater, founded by his friend Mieczysław Kotlarczyk. The group performed classical Polish drama in private apartments before audiences of around 20 people in darkness and silence so as not to attract the attention of the German police. This was an act of cultural resistance, an assertion that the Polish spirit could not be destroyed even while the country was occupied. Karol Wojtyla had genuine acting talent and a real passion for literature. Many contemporaries and later observers have wondered, if there had been no war, no succession of family losses, if his life had taken a different course, might he have become an actor or a writer rather than a priest and a pope? That question has no answer, but it tells us something important. Karol Wojtyla did not come to the religious life because he had no other option. He came to it after having considered and experienced other paths. In 1942, he decided to pursue the religious vocation and began studying at a secret seminary in Krakow. Secret because the Germans had shut down all formal seminaries. Archbishop Adam Stefan Sapieha had authorized the clandestine training of seminarians within the archbishop's residence to shield them from German scrutiny. In the final months of the war, as the Germans were retreating and rounding up all young men, either for the army or for execution, Sapieha ordered all the secret seminarians to move into the archbishop's residence for their protection. Karol Wojtyla lived there from August 1944 to January 1945, the day Soviet forces liberated Krakow and the war in Poland was effectively over. Karol Wojtyla was ordained a priest on November 1, 1946 in Krakow, All Saints' Day, a detail many would later read as significant. Almost immediately afterward, Archbishop Sapieha sent him to Rome to study at the Angelicum, the renowned Dominican school of theology. This was the first time Wojtyla had left Poland and seen the wider world. He graduated with a doctoral dissertation on the theology of St. John of the Cross, the 16th century Spanish mystical poet and theologian. The dissertation revealed the depth of his intellectual and theological formation. He was not merely a devout man, but a rigorous and systematic thinker on the most complex philosophical questions of faith. Returning to Poland, which by now lay under the communist government installed by the Soviet Union, Wojtyla served as a parish priest in rural communities, then as a lecturer in ethics at the Catholic University of Lublin, one of the very few Catholic universities permitted to operate within the communist bloc. It was at Lublin that he developed his philosophical thought on the human person and human dignity, ideas that would later become the philosophical foundation of his entire pontificate. He was deeply influenced by the school of philosophy known as phenomenology, particularly by Edmund Husserl and Max Scheler, and he combined those ideas with Thomistic theology to construct a vision of the human being that placed the inviolable dignity of each individual at its center. In a communist environment where the state declared that human beings were merely cogs in a social machine, this vision was an act of philosophical resistance. In 1958, at the age of 38, Wojtyla was consecrated as auxiliary bishop of Krakow, becoming the youngest bishop in Poland at the time. In 1964, he became Archbishop of Krakow, and in 1967, he was made a cardinal, one of the youngest in the world at that moment. To understand John Paul II, one must understand what he learned from more than 30 years of living and working under the communist regime in Poland. The Polish communist state could not destroy the Catholic Church, and it tried. It closed Catholic schools, confiscated church property, arrested and imprisoned numerous priests and religious, imposed heavy restrictions on religious activity, and propagandized relentlessly that religion was the opium of the people and a backward relic that would disappear with the advance of socialism. But the church did not disappear. On the contrary, under those conditions, the faith of the Polish people deepened and became a more essential part of their national identity than ever before. Attending Mass was not merely a religious act, it was an act of political resistance. The church became the only space in Poland that the communist state could not fully control, a place where one could speak the truth, hear the truth, and feel that one was not entirely enslaved. Wojtyla learned from that experience that spiritual power, when rooted in the real lives of real people, is far stronger than material power. That a state can control the body, but cannot control the soul. That true freedom begins from within, from a person's relationship with the sacred, and no prison or gulag can take that away. He also learned that the right words, spoken at the right moment to the right people, can move mountains, that a speech matters more than a decree, that naming truth, calling evil by its name and goodness by its name, is the most important political and spiritual act a leader can perform. Those lessons would shape his entire pontificate. Less than a year after being elected Pope, John Paul II did what many consider the single most important and historically consequential act of his entire pontificate. He returned to Poland. The visit took place from June 2nd to 10th, 1979. 9 days that many historians have since called the 9 days that changed the history of the world. The Polish communist government knew the visit was dangerous. They tried to negotiate his non-attendance, and when they could not prevent it, they tried to limit the scale and impact of the visit. They kept coverage on state media minimal. They arranged no official street decorations. But none of that mattered, because the Polish people took care of everything themselves. When John Paul II landed in Warsaw, millions lined the roads to welcome him. No one had organized this, no government, no committee. People came because they wanted to come, because this was the first Pole ever to become Pope, and he was coming home. In Warsaw, he celebrated an outdoor mass in Victory Square, a location laden with symbolic significance for the communist regime. More than 1 million people attended. When he read a passage of scripture about the Holy Spirit and asked, "Who can drive the Holy Spirit from the history of humanity?" The crowd understood the true meaning of the question and answered with applause that lasted for minutes. In Krakow, his own city, nearly 3 million people gathered for a final encounter. 3 million people. In a country of 35 million at the time, roughly 9% of the entire national population assembled in one place. And the miracle that took place across those 9 days was not any single dramatic event. The miracle was that the Polish people, for the first time in decades, saw themselves not through the eyes of the communist state, but through their own eyes. They saw that they were not alone. They saw that millions of others shared their faith, their desires, their hopes. And from that recognition, something in the national spirit of Poland awoke and never went back to sleep. Zbigniew Brzezinski, national security advisor to President Carter and himself of Polish origin, later said that John Paul II's 1979 visit was the true starting point of the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. Lech Wałęsa, the leader of Poland's Solidarity movement, put it more directly, "Without John Paul II, there would be no solidarity. Without solidarity, there would be no fall of the Iron Curtain." August 1980, more than a year after John Paul II's visit, workers at the Gdańsk shipyard in Poland went on strike and founded the first independent trade union in the communist world, Solidarity, led by Lech Wałęsa. Nothing like this had ever happened in the entire history of the Soviet Union and its satellite states. An independent union, a workers' organization free from state control, was an existential threat to the entire communist system, which claimed to represent the working class while forbidding workers from organizing themselves. John Paul II watched Solidarity's growth from Rome with close attention and undisguised spiritual support. When the Polish government imposed martial law in December 1981, arresting Wałęsa and thousands of Solidarity members, John Paul II spoke out forcefully and lobbied internationally for pressure to be applied. But his role in this story was more complex than simple vocal support. He was an invisible bridge between the Solidarity movement and the outside world, the figure who drew Ronald Reagan, a president intent on fighting the Soviet evil empire, and the CYA to focus particularly on Poland and covertly support Solidarity with funding and printing equipment. According to multiple later sources, the CIA channeled money into Solidarity partly due to indirect encouragement from the Vatican. The combination of Polish national spirit, awakened and nurtured by John Paul II, with economic and political pressure from the West and the Soviet Union's own growing weakness under Gorbachev, created a storm that could not be stopped. In 1989, Poland held its first free elections in decades. Solidarity won by a landslide. The Iron Curtain began to fall, in Poland first, then Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria. On November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall collapsed, to the astonishment of the entire world. And in that chain of domino events, no one disputes that the first brick was pushed in Poland, and the one who pushed it was not a general or a politician, but an old man in white from Wadowice. May the 13th, 1981, the feast day of Our Lady of Fatima. John Paul II was standing on the Pope-mobile, making his way through St. Peter's Square, greeting the tens of thousands gathered there as usual. Mehmet Ali Aka, a Turkish gunman standing in the crowd, raised his weapon and fired 4 shots. 2 struck John Paul II, one passed through his abdomen, another through his hand and arm. John Paul II collapsed into the arms of his assistant. The square erupted in screaming and chaos. An ambulance rushed him to the Gemelli hospital while outside, millions of people around the world prayed for his survival. He underwent many hours of surgery. The doctors later said he had lost nearly 3/4 of his blood and came close to death several times on the operating table. But he survived. When he had recovered enough to speak, the first thing John Paul II asked was whether Acca had been injured. He was worried about the man who had just shot him. When told that Acca was unharmed, he said he forgave him, and he did not stop at words. In 1983, he actually went to the prison to visit Acca, sitting beside him for several minutes in private conversation, an exchange whose full contents have never been disclosed. Acca, who had entered with a defiant expression, left looking confused and moved. Years later, he recalled that he could not understand why John Paul II had come to see him, or why he had forgiven him. John Paul II later said he believed his survival was a miracle of Our Lady of Fatima, because the day of the shooting was her feast day, and because the most dangerous bullet had passed through his body along a trajectory that doctors could not fully explain by medicine alone. He later traveled to Fatima in Portugal to offer the bullet as a thanksgiving, and it was set into the crown of the statue of Our Lady at Fatima, where it remains to this day. Who was behind the assassination? That has never been fully resolved. Acca gave many different accounts over the years, and some leads pointed to Bulgarian intelligence, and through it, possibly to the Soviet KGB. But conclusive evidence was never found, and the case remains one of history's unsolved mysteries. One of the most distinctive things about John Paul II, compared to all the popes before him, was that he traveled extensively. Over his 26 years as pope, he made 104 international apostolic journeys, visiting 129 different countries and traveling a total of more than 1.2 million kilometers. He met hundreds of millions of people in person, more than any other individual in human history. Before John Paul II, popes almost never left Rome. After him, apostolic journeys became an inseparable part of the papacy. He went to places no one imagined a pope would go, to the slums of Rio de Janeiro and Manila, to refugee camps in Africa, to remote villages in Central America. He did not confine himself to great cathedrals or meetings with heads of government. He came down to the streets, shook people's hands, embraced children, listened to the stories of ordinary people. Those journeys were not tourism, they were political and religious instruments. Each visit was a declaration that the Church was present here, that the Catholics here mattered, that the world was watching. In the Philippines in 1995, he celebrated the closing Mass of World Youth Day before a crowd estimated at 4 million people, the largest human gathering in history up to that point. In Cuba in 1998, he met Fidel Castro, one of the strangest encounters of the 20th century, the world's longest-serving communist leader sitting beside the Pope and listening to him preach. He returned to Poland 7 times during his pontificate, each visit like pouring more fuel onto the flame of national spirit that was burning there. John Paul II was the first pope to enter a Jewish synagogue in Rome in 1986, the first pope to visit a mosque in Damascus in 2001, the first pope to preside over a large-scale interfaith gathering, the World Day of Prayer for Peace in Assisi in 1986, where representatives of more than 100 different religions sat together and prayed for peace. In Jerusalem in 2000, he visited Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial, and stood in silence before the names of millions of murdered Jews. Then, he went to the Western Wall, the holiest site in Judaism, and tucked into a crack in the wall a small slip of paper bearing a prayer asking forgiveness for the sins of the children of the Church against the Jewish people. These were acts no pope before him had performed, and they opened dialogues and reconciliations that decades of formal diplomacy had not achieved. Yet at the same time, critics from the progressive side pointed out that John Paul II canonized 483 people and beatified 1,340, more than all his predecessors combined, and that some of these were done in controversial ways. They also noted that despite opening doors to other religions, he maintained firm positions on many issues within the Church. No honest account of John Paul II omits the contentious parts. He firmly upheld the Church's position against the ordination of women, not merely maintaining the stance, but declaring in 1994 that this was a matter definitively settled and no longer open to debate within the Catholic Church. He also held firm against artificial contraception, abortion, and same-sex marriage. Those positions created deep tensions, especially in Western countries where Catholics increasingly held views that diverged from official church teaching. Many Catholics in the United States, Germany, the Netherlands, and elsewhere felt the Church was speaking to them about their lives and bodies in ways that did not fit the reality of how they lived. But the crisis that most severely tested his pontificate was not those issues. It was the sexual abuse crisis within the Church. From the 1980s, and especially through the 1990s and 2000s, mounting reports emerged of Catholic priests who had sexually abused children, and of bishops who had known but concealed it, transferring guilty priests to other parishes rather than reporting them to police or removing them from ministry. John Paul II's response to this crisis was slow and inadequate. For many years, he and those around him appeared not to grasp, or not to want to grasp, the true scale of the problem and the harm it inflicted on victims. He maintained a close relationship with Marcial Maciel Degollado, founder of the Legionaries of Christ, who was later proven to have sexually abused numerous seminarians over decades, even as serious accusations against Maciel mounted. Those who defend John Paul II argue he did not have full knowledge of the scope of the problem and that those around him withheld information. His critics argue he should have known, and that the failure to address the abuse crisis is the gravest stain on his pontificate. Both assessments have merit, and the question of his responsibility for the crisis remains a subject of deep debate inside and outside the Catholic Church. From the late 1990s, John Paul II's health declined noticeably. He was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, a neurological condition causing tremors in the limbs and progressive loss of physical control. Added to this were the after effects of the 1981 assassination attempt, other injuries from his active life, and the weight of age. But he did not relinquish his office. He continued to appear in public, to travel despite increasing difficulty, to celebrate Mass even when he could no longer stand unaided. Many around him, including some cardinals, quietly hoped or suggested that he should resign when his health no longer permitted him to carry out his duties fully. John Paul II refused. He said that popes do not resign, that the office is for life, like marriage. And he wished to demonstrate through his own life that the elderly and the ill still possess dignity and worth, that life does not end when the body weakens. The final image of John Paul II before the public, a trembling man, his voice barely audible, yet still straining to bless the crowd from the window of the Apostolic Palace, is among the most remembered of his life. He died on April 2, 2005, at 9:37 in the evening Rome time, in his room in the Apostolic Palace. He was 84 years old. As news spread, tens of thousands of people poured into St. Peter's Square and stood in the cold night, praying and weeping. In the days that followed, an estimated 4 million pilgrims from across the world came to Rome to pay their respects, so many that the line to see him one last time stretched for 24 hours. In 2011, 6 years after his death, far faster than the usual process, John Paul II was beatified. In 2014, he was canonized. But his true legacy does not lie in those titles. It lies in the real-world changes he brought about. He was a crucial contributor to the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, not through weapons or economic policy, but by rekindling the flame of spirit and human dignity in the hearts of millions living under totalitarian rule. This is a contribution that cannot be quantified, but cannot be denied. He transformed the Catholic Church's relationship with Jewish people and with other religions in ways that were deep and lasting. His apologies and gestures of reconciliation opened dialogues the world is still carrying forward. He redefined the papacy as a global mission, not a figure seated in the Vatican issuing decrees, but one who travels the world to meet and listen. And he was a man who, through his own life, through the losses of his early childhood, through years under totalitarian regimes, through a bullet that could not kill him, and through his final years of illness, demonstrated that human dignity does not depend on health, on power, or on outward circumstance. It lives within, and no one can take it away. That is perhaps the deepest and most enduring legacy of the man from Waterways, who came to the world from a far-away country, stood on the balcony of St. Peter's with a warm Polish voice, and for the next 26 years traveled the world reminding everyone that each human being, wherever they are, matters and has worth.